Section 19 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 15, The Great War, Part 2. The following afternoon, the program was one of real symphonic proportions and included Saint-Saëns' Great Symphony No. 3 for orchestra, organ, and piano, Debussy's L'après-midi d'une faune, and the symphonic variations for piano with orchestra by César Franck. The organ part in the symphony was played by Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger, without doubt the greatest woman musician I have ever known, and the Franck variations were superbly interpreted by Alfred Cortot. Monsieur Casadisou played an exquisite concerto for the viola d'amour by Lorenzetti. The little Salle du Conservatoire, its quaint architecture dating from the time of Louis XVI, with its tiny boxes and balconies, was jammed to the doors. The janitor told me that it was the largest audience he had ever seen there. Every available space was filled twice over, and the walls literally bulged outward. The audience was a very interesting one. The French government, with its usual politeness, had sent official representatives from the Ministère des Étrangers, the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, and the French High Commission, many of them in uniform. There were also many French musicians of distinction, among them dear Maître Charles Widor, the Secrétaire Perpétuel de l'Institut de France, and of course many French, British, and American soldiers. A New York fire commissioner would have gasped at the way in which all precautions were disregarded, and the excitement in the audience when at the end of the concert we played the Marseillaise and the Star-Spangled Banner can be imagined. To add to my pleasure, my daughter Alice, who was doing war work away down in Brest, had received permission to come up to Paris for the great occasion. My old friend Paul Cravath, vice president of the New York Symphony Society, who was at that time at the head of our finance commission in London, had flown over in an English airplane and smiled upon me from a center box in all his splendor of 6'4" as I turned around to make my bow to the cheering audience. I think we gave them an exceedingly good concert. The orchestra were delightful in their keen desire to carry out my intentions, but I think if we had played less well, the enthusiasm would have been just as great, for while we were playing, the names of Seicheprey and Chateau Thierry were vibrating in the hearts of all listeners, and their enthusiasm was poured out upon me as if I, single-handed, demonstrated the valor of our American troops. At the end of the concert, the president of the Musical Orchestral Union of Paris presented me with a large bouquet of roses tied with the American colors, and in a very eloquent speech voiced the gratitude of the French musicians for the assistance which had been given them by our Society of American Friends of Musicians in France. I was able to supplement my words of thanks with a further substantial check, which had been sent by Mr. Flagler, and which was to be devoted to the families of orchestral musicians serving at the front. The week had been fully occupied with the preparations for these two concerts, but notwithstanding the attendant excitements and elations, I had periods of great despondency. The possibility of continuing my mission in France seemed less and less capable of fulfillment, partly owing to the tense military situation, and partly because I did not seem to get the proper assistance from the YMCA. Mr. McLean and Mr. Sloan, at the head of affairs in New York, had given me their enthusiastic support, and I had sailed at their urgent request. They had cabled and written full instructions to the Y in France, and on my arrival Mr. Ernest Carter, the head worker, whom I liked exceedingly, had promised me the fullest cooperation, but he was evidently harassed and overworked, and did not get the efficient help which he should have had in the running of so large an organization in wartime. Many of the heads of departments were ex-clergymen or church and Sunday school workers who were evidently inexperienced in the management of practical affairs. I am told that later on this condition was much improved, and that the men who were subsequently sent out from America were chosen more for their business ability, but at the time I mention, the confusion at the headquarters in the Rue d'Aguesseau was often great, and there seemed to be insufficient cooperation between the different departments. In order to be able to travel around France unmolested, I had to have a carte rouge, and this card it seemed impossible to obtain for me, notwithstanding all my proper and complete credentials as an American, as a musician well known all over our country, and above all, as a persona grata with the French government. A few days before my first concert, I was informed that it was impossible to procure this card for me, and that therefore I could not be permitted to leave Paris. When I asked for an explanation, it was refused by a rather sanctimonious person, who put his arm around me, called me brother, but expressed his regret at the unfortunate fact of my having been born in Germany. I swallowed my rage as best I could, but my chagrin was all the greater because in the meantime Monsieur Casadisou and 4 other distinguished French artists had offered me their services to travel around with me in a motor car and give concerts in our camps and hospitals. I finally obtained the information from a very nice young man who was in charge of the entertainment division of the Y that he understood that the objections came from the intelligence department of the AEF. I immediately called on Major Cabot Ward, the head of the intelligence division in Paris, whom I had known in New York for 25 years. I showed him my various credentials, and he assured me that, as far as the United States Army is concerned, you are as free as air. I returned with this information to the Rue d'Aguesseau, and was met by the same impenetrable wall of ignorance or ill will, and as my friends at the French High Commission had already assured me that as far as they were concerned all France was open to me, I seemed to be at my wits' end how to unravel this riddle. I finally called on my friend Robert Bliss, counselor of our embassy in Paris. I can never forget his kindness and helpfulness during this period. He and his charming wife had made their apartment the very center of American life during those trying times. Mrs. Bliss had resolutely refused to leave Paris, and dispensed a generous hospitality at their apartment in the Rue Henri Moisson. When I told him of my troubles, and that I, who had lived in America 47 years, should now be thus treated, he smiled and said, "We can do nothing for you at present, as you are still a part of the organization of the YMCA, but as soon as you get that uniform off, you will find every road open to you." That wretched uniform! It had annoyed me from the first moment I had put it on, because the tailor to whom the Y had sent me had made a miserable job of it. It was too narrow between the shoulders, which is fatal for an orchestral conductor, and the trousers were a tragedy. But there was no time before sailing to order a better fitting uniform, and as I had been told that I could not move an inch in France without it, I had literally taken no civilian clothes with me. I had ordered some new clothes in Paris, but there was a tailor's strike on, and I was therefore, for decency's sake, compelled to hold on to that uniform, much as I longed to divest myself of the symbol of the sacred triangle. However, I began to see daylight, and as I hoped by the following Monday or Tuesday to get my new civilian clothes, I decided to conduct the 2 concerts on Saturday and Sunday, and then magnificently hand in my resignation. But I was not spared a last drop of bitterness, for on Saturday morning I received a visit from a very stupid and exasperating officier de liaison of the YMCA, who proceeded to inform me that as I had been born in Germany and therefore could not obtain my carte rouge, the committee of the Y thought that I should not conduct the 2 concerts in their uniform. Again, that accursed uniform. I was so enraged that I said I would either conduct in it or in my underclothes, that my resignation had already been written and would be presented on Monday, and that I insisted on an interview with Mr. Carter and his executive committee, as I wished them to know how I had been treated. I knew that Mr. Carter, poor man, had no knowledge of the entire affair, as he had been zigzagging around France all this time to the various posts and supply centers of the Y, trying to bring some kind of order out of chaos. He immediately accorded me a meeting, and when I told my story, made me an apology so ample and generous that I left him with none but the kindliest feelings, and really regretted that he, a man of high ideals and spiritual power, should through the exigencies of war have been so overburdened with practical affairs. For a few of his aides I have nothing but absolute contempt, but there were many among the men workers, and certainly the majority of the women, who gave wonderful service, and gladly suffered all kinds of annoyances and deprivations in order to help the soldiers, who were not all angels by any means. But my real triumph was to come on the very Sunday morning of my concert, when General Charles Dawes of the American Army called on me at my hotel, and to my amazement asked me whether I could come to the general headquarters of the AEF at Chaumont and confer with General Pershing regarding the possible improvement of our army bands. I could not believe my ears, that so suddenly after my bitter experiences with the Y, the Commander-in-Chief of the American Army in France had personally sent for me. General Dawes was at that time at the head of the Army Supplies, with headquarters in Paris. A great lover of music, he had contributed largely to its cultivation in his own city of Chicago. He was an old and valued friend of General Pershing, and I think that it was he who had suggested my name to him. I can never thank General Dawes enough for giving me, a musician and over 50 years of age, this wonderful opportunity to touch even the outer hem of the robes of the war goddess. Needless to say, my despondent mood immediately changed to one of elation. I accepted the invitation with alacrity and arranged with General Dawes to go to Chaumont on the following Wednesday, July 17. In the meantime, the air had been full of rumors regarding the Big Bertha, who had been conveniently silent ever since my arrival in Paris. It was persistently said that on Monday morning 17 of these ladies, bearing the same name, would again begin a bombardment of Paris, and I confess that it gave me something of a shock when, on the Monday morning after my concert, while I was still luxuriating in bed, thinking with pleasure of the triumphs of the day before, and with eager anticipation of my approaching trip to Chaumont, I suddenly heard a curious reverberation different from the explosions of the Gothas or of the answering air guns. It was the first greeting of Madame Bertha, and this greeting was repeated punctiliously every 15 minutes throughout the day, the shells striking in Paris in different quarters. It was interesting to watch the French people. After every shot, crowds of them would run into the streets, talking, gesticulating, and speculating where that particular shell had fallen. This would go on for 13 or 14 minutes, and then all would scoot back into their shops and houses as they knew that the next shell was about due. That evening I had been invited to dine at Mrs. Edith Wharton's at her lovely apartment in the Rue de Varennes. Just as I got to her door, a Frenchman stopped and said to me that he had been at the concert on the preceding day. He then added, "I see that you are making the acquaintance of La Grosse Bertha." Thinking that he referred to the return of the bombardment, I smiled assent, and then proceeded to Mrs. Wharton's apartment. I found our great novelist with 2 other ladies, an American officer and an American composer, my dear friend Blair Fairchild, who had been living in Paris for several years and was acting most ably as distributing agent for the money which our Society of American Friends of Musicians in France was sending over. The dinner proceeded as if we lived in times of deepest peace. It was served with punctilious efficiency. The flowers were charming and the conversation delightful, and it was only when dinner was half over that I found out, quite casually, that what my French gentleman at the door had referred to was that only 2 minutes before my arrival, the last shell of the Big Bertha had fallen on the roof of the house opposite, demolishing it and parts of the upper story. On the following Wednesday, July 17, I took the morning train for Chaumont, again comfortably clad in civilian clothes. I was met at the station by a young officer, Lieutenant Wendell, nephew of my old friend Everett Wendell, who took me to General Headquarters and introduced me to Lieutenant Colonel Collins, Secretary of the General Staff, who explained to me in detail various points on which General Pershing desired information and assistance. I was then most comfortably put up at the guest house, formerly a large private residence in the town, which had been taken over by General Pershing to accommodate his visitors. I was to dine at his chateau that evening, and spent a great part of the afternoon walking through the quaint old hill town, situated on a high cliff overlooking the valley of the Marne. It was during this walk that I saw the only drunken American private during my 3 months' stay in France. I was following a picturesque road leading out of the town into the country, when a colored boy in khaki reeled toward me and said, "Excuse me, sah, are you a Frenchman?" I said no, and he replied, "Then for God's sake, will you please tell me where I can get a drink?" I answered, "No, you have evidently had enough already." He tried to follow me, and I, seeing 2 white soldiers approaching, turned to them and said, "I think you had better take care of this boy. He has had too much to drink." They briskly answered, "Certainly, sir," but as they went up to him, he kept peering at me and said, "I want to talk to that gentleman. That's Mr. Damrosch." I laughed out loud, for here I was, over 3,000 miles from home, and this boy, who perhaps had musical inclinations and had heard me conduct in some concert, recognized me even through the alcoholic vapors which surrounded him so thickly that one could have cut them with a knife. One of the other visitors at the guest house was General Omar Bundy, who commanded the 1st Division and had come to Chaumont to receive the congratulations of the Commander-in-Chief on the splendid work of his division. He proved a delightful gentleman, and we chatted together very amicably as a motor car took us that evening about 5 miles beyond Chaumont, through most lovely country to the chateau surrounded by exquisite gardens and woods, which General Pershing had taken for his personal residence. A scene of greater peace and tranquility could not be imagined, and literally the only sign and symbol of war was the solitary sentry pacing up and down before the entrance with bayonet fixed. As this happened to be the first day of General Foch's great attack, in which he pushed the Germans back 6 miles, General Pershing, who had been at the front all day, had not yet returned, and General Bundy and I walked through the grounds in the lovely evening twilight for perhaps half an hour, when a motor car drove up, and our great Commander-in-Chief, accompanied by his aide, immediately came over to us and made us welcome in hearty and simple fashion. He reminded me that we had met at the Presidio in San Francisco during the great exhibition of 1915, and indeed I remembered it well, for shortly afterward he had been sent to the Mexican border in command of the troops, and while there had been overwhelmed by the terrible tragedy of the death of his wife and children, who were suffocated in a fire at night which destroyed their home at the Presidio. So much has been written regarding the wonderful impression which General Pershing made in Europe on all who came in contact with him that it is not necessary for me to more than echo the general chorus of praise. Soldierly, dignified, courteous, and simple in his bearing, wearing a uniform as only a man can who has been a soldier all his life. We entered the house and shortly after sat down to dinner. The party consisted of the Commander-in-Chief, General Bundy, and a most delightful staff of 8 officers, I being the only civilian. As such, I expected and half hoped that the talk would be all about the wonderful success of the first day's push by Foch, of which I had already heard enthusiastic rumors in the town, or of great military secrets, affairs of strategy, monster guns, thousands of airplanes, and new, mysterious machines of destruction. But, to my surprise, the conversation during almost the entire dinner was of music, of its influence in raising the spirits of the soldier, in giving him the right kind of recreation, and the necessary relief from the monotony of camp work, or the horrors of battle. General Pershing told me that after hearing some of the crack military bands of France and England, he had been so overwhelmed by the consciousness of our inferiority that he was eager to know if something could not be done to improve the general standard of our army bands, and, more particularly, whether it might not be possible, at least, to take out the best players from among the bands then in France, and to form a headquarters band of superior excellence, led by the best bandmaster among them, and in this way form a model which the others could endeavor to copy. This suggestion seemed to me excellent, and I asked how many bandmasters there were at present in France, as I would like to examine them as to their fitness. General Pershing said, with a smile, that there were over 200, but this did not faze me, and I agreed to examine them all, provided that proper arrangements could be made for a fitting test of their qualifications. Various plans for such an examination were discussed, and General Pershing finally decided to send them all to Paris in batches of 50 every week, together with a military band, which should be stationed there for the following 4 or 5 weeks, thus giving me abundant opportunity to test their efficiency in conducting as well as in harmony and orchestration. It seemed to me at the time remarkable that, in the midst of war, and with all its many immediate necessities weighing upon him, General Pershing should have had the acumen to perceive the value of music in wartime and to interest himself in its improvement. As I sat there, the memory of the hollow-cheeked bandmaster Tyler, who had stood next to me at the 4th of July parade in Paris, suddenly came back. I thought to myself that here I was, the only civilian at the table, and that therefore I might say anything I pleased without being put up against a wall at sunrise and shot, for at the worst they could only consider me as very ignorant of army customs. Therefore I watched for my opportunity, and suddenly plunged in, and spoke of my conversation with Bandmaster Tyler while we were waiting for our Marines to march down the Champs-Élysées. I said that in my humble opinion it was a great mistake to use musicians as stretcher-bearers in battle, not that their lives as soldiers were any more valuable than those of any others in the army, but that a stretcher-bearer could be trained in a very short time, while it took many months to train a bandsman, that the Canadian regiments had followed the same custom during the first months of the war, but the results had been so dire in destroying the bands and their usefulness that the soldiers themselves had implored their commanding officers not to let their bandsmen be sacrificed in this way, as there was nothing so terrible as coming back after battle to a silent and therefore desolate camp. After I had finished my rather impassioned peroration, General Bundy and others heartily agreed with me, but General Pershing said nothing at all, and I felt that I had perhaps talked too much and mal apropos. But the following morning, as I was seated with Colonel Collins at General Headquarters, arranging the details of my examinations, he smilingly handed me an order from the Commander-in-Chief, which had just arrived, and which was to be sent to the division commanders, to the effect that from now on bandsmen are not to be used any longer as stretcher-bearers, except in cases of extreme military urgency. One of General Pershing's remarks during the dinner is so characteristic that I repeat it here. He said, "When peace is declared and our bands march up Fifth Avenue, I should like them to play so well that it will be another proof of the advantage of military training." Subsequent developments and meetings with this interesting man further deepened the impression which he made upon me. I returned to Paris and proceeded to make all necessary arrangements for the examinations of the 200 bandmasters. Our army had leased a large hotel near the Bastille on the banks of the Seine, and a large room on the ground floor served admirably for my purpose. The band of the 329th Infantry soon arrived and was quartered in this hotel, and every morning at 9:30 the examinations began, and continued from Monday to Thursday at the rate of about 50 bandmasters a week, who arrived from all quarters of France, from the seaport towns, from the training camps, and some even from the very front line of the trenches. Fridays I would usually return to headquarters and report on my findings and begin recommendations, which gradually assumed greater and greater proportions as the magnitude of the work developed. To assist me in this prodigious work, I engaged the services of Monsieur Francis Casadisou, brother of Henri, and a splendid musician. He examined the men as to their qualifications in instrumentation and in their general knowledge of the various instruments, while I examined them in the actual process of conducting and drilling a band. I would first let them bite their teeth into an overture like the Oberon of Weber, or a movement from a classical symphony, and then would let them conduct a composition of their own choice. I found very soon that while most of these young bandmasters were musically talented and ambitious, they had had no or but little opportunity for acquiring what we may call the technique of the baton. They had had no intensive disciplinary training, such as our young officers from civilian life had received at Plattsburgh and similar camps. Many of them did not know how to beat time properly, much less train a band in phrasing or rhythmic accuracy, and I soon saw that unless some opportunity was given them to learn at least the rudiments of their calling, the effort toward improving our bands would be useless. It therefore seemed to me that the quick formation of a bandmaster's school was the only solution of the problem, and as our army had had the help of French military and aviation officers as instructors, loaned to us by the Ministère de la Guerre, I thought that a similar arrangement could be made, under which we might obtain the necessary musical instructors also from the French army, as nearly all the musicians of France were at that time in uniform. I also discovered that some of the most important musical instruments, which give mellowness and nobility to the tone of a band, were almost utterly lacking. We had hardly any oboes, bassoons, French horns, or flugelhorns. I knew that some of the greatest masters of these instruments, first prizes of the Conservatoire of Paris, were serving in the French army, and immediately, through the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, obtained their names and the regiments to which they belonged. On the following visit to Chaumont, I proposed to General Pershing that we form a music school at which 50 bandmasters could get the most intensive musical training and discipline for 8 weeks, to be succeeded by a new batch of 50, etc., and at the same time 40 pupils, each in oboe, bassoon, French horn, and flugelhorn, could get a similar training of 12 weeks on their respective instruments. General Pershing and his staff were delighted with the plan, and I offered to procure the necessary instructors from the French army, promising General Pershing that the school would be in complete running order by October 1st, provided a proper building could be obtained. The general asked me where I wished to place the school, and offered me Langres, where several schools on the strategy of war were already in progress, but I claimed that the surroundings for my music school should be of a more peaceful and even academic character, and suggested Chaumont. General Pershing smiled, but insisted that it was already overcrowded, and that I would not be able to find a building large enough to house so great a number of instructors and pupils. He gave me full power, however, to see what could be done, and I set forth immediately with a French liaison officer, member of the French Military Commission at Chaumont, and in G5 General Headquarters, under which department the proposed music school would come, who proved a most remarkable and valuable assistant in my work. He was Lieutenant Michel Weil, nephew of the owner of the well-known White House in San Francisco, and an enthusiastic musical amateur who, through his long residence in America, had acquired a knowledge of English and a sympathy for America only second to that for his own native land. He belonged to a delightful French officers' mess at Chaumont, and they immediately made me a kind of honorary member, and in most hospitable fashion invited me to their LesWilLang repasts. As they were all enthusiastic lovers of music, I endeavored to repay them by pounding out Wagner, their supreme favorite, to their heart's content on an old upright piano placed in a little sitting room next to their salle à manger. Lieutenant Weil and I first paid a visite de cérémonie to the mayor of Chaumont and explained to him our desire. The idea of what he called un petit conservatoire de musique pour les Américains in Chaumont appealed to his fancy immensely, and he immediately picked up his telephone and called up an old friend of his, a fellow citizen and mill owner. He explained to him the great honor that was about to befall their town, if a proper building could be found, and exhorted him to show himself as a really patriotic citizen of France and friend of the Americans by giving the mill, which he owned just outside the city, and only a few minutes' walk from our headquarters, for this noble purpose. We motored to this building and met there an elderly, dignified, and courteous Frenchman, who told us that anything he had was at the disposal of les Américains. We found a huge mill with walls 2 feet thick, the machinery in disuse, and with large empty spaces that our army engineers could easily turn into sleeping quarters, practicing rooms, and other needs for a music school. In one large wing we found a few women and many children playing about. I said, "Of course, we shall need this wing also." "Then I regret," answered the owner, "but this wing you cannot have, because I have given it to 48 refugees from Verdun, with the promise that they shall occupy it until the end of the war." Naturally, Lieutenant Weil and I reconsidered, and concluded that a large tent could be put up in the meadow as an eating place, and that we could get along without the extra wing. I then asked the owner what rental he would demand. "Oh," he said, "anything that the American army wishes to pay." But when Lieutenant Weil informed him that he should fix a fair price, he asked timidly, "Would the American army consider 500 francs a month reasonable?" I tell this to offset the tales of those people who keep harping on the commercial greed of the French in anything that concerns the needs of the American soldier. We returned to General Headquarters jubilant, and, after a satisfactory interview with the officer in charge of building operations, it was decided to place the school in Chaumont, and I returned to Paris to complete my plans. My brother Frank had recognized the lack of good schooling for our army bands and bandmasters many years before the war, and had very patriotically placed the entire machinery of his Institute of Musical Art at the disposal of the Secretary of War. An arrangement had accordingly been made by which a bandmaster's school at Governor's Island, New York, was placed under my brother's control, and for several years before the war a small number of bandmasters were graduated from it who ranked well on a par with those of other countries. But when we entered the war, and our army was organized on a scale of millions, these were but a drop in the bucket, and heroic measures were necessary to bring some semblance of order into this musical chaos of hundreds of uneducated bandmasters and thousands of still less educated bandsmen. End of section 19. Section 20 of my musical life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 15, The Great War, Part 3. During these 5 weeks in Paris and Chaumont, I worked very hard, and while my life has been crowded with affairs of all kinds relating to my profession, I cannot recall any time when the work was so constant, day and night, or when I was more jubilantly happy in the doing of it. During the forenoons, Cbteddy and I would examine the bandmasters, discover what they could and could not do, give them, so to speak, first aid to the wounded by pointing out their worst failings or their greatest weaknesses. In the afternoons, Lieutenant Weil and I would run around to the various French government departments on the track of this or that musician whom we wished to corral as professor for our school. At night, I would sit propped up in bed and work out the entire tuition plan of the school, down to the minutest details. My general recommendations to General Headquarters, all of which were subsequently carried out, included classes for the bandmaster's instruction in the technique of conducting, in harmony, and in orchestration. These classes were put in charge of M. Francis Cbteddy and M. André Caplet. The latter was later on succeeded by Lieutenant Albert Stussel, a highly talented bandmaster in our army, who has returned to civilian life and has now become my successor as conductor of the New York Oratorio Society. Captain Ellicott of the AEF became the military head of the school, to which he gave most sympathetic assistance. There were 2 professors, each for oboe, bassoon, French horn, and flugelhorn, all of whom were graduates and first prizes of the famous Paris Conservatoire. I also recommended that the beautiful B-flat bugles of the French army be adopted by us, and that a French drum major, proficient on this instrument, be appointed as instructor to drill successive classes of 50 for 1 month each, the graduates to become first buglers of our regiments, in order that they might, in turn, instruct other buglers in their respective drum and bugle corps. At the examinations, I also asked the bandmasters certain questions regarding their position in their respective regiments, the attitude of their colonel toward music, their general treatment, and the hours allowed them for musical practice. And here I came on all kinds of conditions. Some of the commanding officers had no sympathy with music or with the bandsmen, and instead of making them practice their 6 hours a day, they were put to work as kitchen police and on other fatigue duties. I therefore urged that the commanding officers be impressed with the fact that the primary object of the band is not to fight, but to cheer the fighters, and the better their music, the greater its beneficial effects upon the spirit of the soldiers, and that therefore all bandsmen should be compelled to devote at least 5 or 6 hours every day to the practice of their instruments and to rehearsals, and that other duties should be made subsidiary to their musical work, and should not be of a character to unfit them for a proper performance on their respective instruments. I also discovered that there was a terrible wastage as regards musical instruments, and that in several instances, preparatory to going into action, the instruments had been thrown away or simply left behind, never more to be recovered, and that therefore it might be wise to appoint a traveling inspector of musical instruments, whose duties should be to attend to the speedy replacement of missing parts, the repairing of instruments, and the supplying of new music. A really excellent headquarters band was formed at Chaumont, which became a source of much gratification to the commander-in-chief and his staff, accompanying him on many of his ceremonial visits and functions. One of my most important recommendations for the school was that every week at least one concert should be given by the professors and such of the bandsmen as were really competent musicians. The programs should be made up only of the great master composers, in order that the students, many of whom had come from isolated communities in our country and had had but little opportunity to hear good music, should become sensitive to the finer and more spiritual qualities of music as an art. This was carried out in most remarkable fashion during the entire existence of the school, and the programs and their performance were worthy of a place in any highly cultivated musical community. When I returned to Chaumont on a visit of inspection the following year, I heard one of these concerts, which included a quintet of Mozart for oboe and strings, and a sonata for violin and piano by César Franck. I sat in delighted amazement as I saw the happy faces of over 100 students in khaki who were listening to this divine music in rapt silence. What a pity that such a school cannot be founded in every state in America now that the war is over and our soldiers have returned home. This would speedily result in an excellent band for every town and lay a real foundation for the musical development of the people at large. During these weeks in Paris, I also saw a great deal of some of my French musician colleagues, all of whom had refused to leave Paris in spite of the Gothas and Berthas. When I first called on Charles-Marie Widor, the famous old organist of Saint-Sulpice, I found him installed, by virtue of his office as Secrétaire Perpétuel of the Institut de France, in a charming Louis XVI suite of rooms in that building. He showed me a hole in the window of his workroom, and told me that a few days before he had just stooped down to pick up a musical score from the floor, when a shell from the Big Bertha burst in front of his apartment, and a piece of it hurtled through his window, missing him only because he was in a stooping position. His Gallic wit and versatility make him a delightful companion, and I am grateful for the opportunity the war gave me for more intimate acquaintance and friendship with him. Indeed, this applies to all the friends made during that eventful summer. The war brought us more quickly and closely together than would have been possible otherwise, and as I was an American, I reaped the full advantage of all the intense gratitude which the French felt for us, some of which was hardly deserved, as our government certainly had shilly-shallied and waited until it was almost too late before they threw our great weight of men and treasure into the balance. I have already spoken of Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger, who played the organ for me at the performance of Saint-Saëns' Third Symphony on July 14th. Among women, I have never met her equal in musicianship, and indeed there are very few men who can compare with her. She is one of the finest organists of France, an excellent pianist, and the best reader of orchestral scores that I have ever known. Again and again, I have seen her take up a manuscript orchestral score, sit down with it at the piano, and brilliantly read it at sight, transcribing it for the piano as she played along. When we first met, she and her dear mother were in the greatest grief. A younger sister, Lily, had died only a month before, at 24 years of age. Beautiful, exquisite, and marvelously talented, she had won the much-coveted Prix de Rome 3 years before, the first woman to have gained it. A mortal illness had slowly sapped her strength, and as she had been the idol of her mother and sister, her loss was to them a tragedy almost beyond endurance. Nadia, besides keeping up her professional duties, she was substitute organist at the Madeleine during the war, hurled herself into war work, and more especially the care of the students of the Conservatoire, who were at the front. She knew all their names and the numbers of their organizations, and founded a kind of musical gazette, mimeographed copies of which were sent out every month to the students. All kinds of musical news and musical questions were published in it, so that these boys, in the midst of their military duties, or while convalescing from their wounds in the hospitals, could have something to think about more immediately connected with their own profession. It is interesting to note that, in answer to the question, should German composers like Brahms and Wagner be played at our concerts during the war? Out of 58, 47 answered unequivocally yes for Wagner and Brahms, 3 yes for Beethoven and the classics, 2 were undecided, and 6 said no. These answers were accompanied, in many cases, by highly interesting essays on art and nationality of art, and altogether the judgments thus expressed reflect the high intellectual standard of these young French artists at the front. I saw many instances of how keenly the French separate their artistic from their political convictions. One night my friends of the French Military Commission at Chaumont had come to Paris, and one of them, Captain Guenier, invited me to dinner at his apartment. His wife and the wife of one of his colleagues had come to Paris from the country, especially for the occasion. We sat down, a very jolly party of 6, to a most delicious dinner, such as only the French can devise and properly execute. As all the party were musical, we naturally had a good deal of music after dinner. The ladies sang charmingly, and I had to play excerpts from their beloved Wagner, Tristan, Meistersinger, Parsifal, and the Trilogy. My host sang songs of Fauré, Chausson, and Debussy, and just then the sirens boomed out their disagreeable message that the Gothas were taking advantage of the moonlit night to make one of their raids over Paris. At the same moment, the taxicab man, who had come to take me back to my hotel, announced that he had arrived. Would he like to come upstairs? Oh, no, he would just sit inside the cab and wait till I got ready. Then let us have some more music, said my hostess, and simply drew the curtain over the windows. And while the Gothas were scattering their shells over Paris, she turned to me and said, "Now let me sing for you this lovely song of Schubert." There was my French hostess singing German songs, and it was not until about 1 o'clock in the morning that Lieutenant Weil and I turned homeward. The vast difference in attitude between the French and certain of my compatriots regarding the proper stand to be taken in time of war toward the art of an enemy nation was very striking. I had myself decided that the New York Symphony Orchestra should not play the works of living German composers, and that the German language should not be sung at our concerts during the war. There seemed to me good and valid reasons for such a course, but Beethoven, Mozart, and Wagner I considered as classics, belonging to us just as much as to Germany, and their divine message had naught to do with the political and military leaders of Germany, who had plunged the world into this horrible bath of blood. There was, however, in New York, a small but noisy group led by a few women who sought to demonstrate their patriotism by hysterical outbursts and newspaper protests against the performance of all music composed by Germans, no matter how many years ago. Some of these women, through the curious psychosis of war, really thought that they were serving their country by their protests. In the winter of 1918, the orchestra of the Paris Conservatoire made a tour through America under their conductor, André Messager. When I called on him the day after his arrival, he showed me a letter he had just received from one of these women protesting against his performing a Beethoven symphony during his stay in America. He was white with anger, and when I asked him how he would answer it, he said, "I will answer it as a French artist should." I said, "The best way to answer would be to put Beethoven's Eroica Symphony on your first program." "I will," he said, and he did. The opposition to Wagner was based on very amusing premises, because some of his heroes were wont to appear on the stage in very blonde wigs and beards. These lady sleuth-hounds seemed to perceive some evil and subtle connection between Siegfried in the Nibelungen trilogy and Nietzsche's blonde beast, which, according to his prophecy, was eventually to control the earth. Their studies of Wagner were too shallow to enable them to realize that the whole philosophy of life, as expressed by Wagner in the Nibelungen trilogy, was in direct contrast to the desire of the modern militaristic German to rule and control the world by force. Wagner depicts a prehistoric world in which the gods of greed, lust, and power rule, carrying, however, the seed of their own destruction within them because of the materialistic quality of their desires. As their power wanes and the old gods perish, a new religion is born, the religion of self-sacrifice through love, as symbolized by Brunhilde in her self-immolation on the funeral pyre of Siegfried. But all this is already ancient history, and I for one confidently believe that the racial spirit which created the Germany of Bach, Beethoven, Goethe, Kant, and Wagner will soon return again to brighten and ennoble the world. In 5 weeks, all necessary arrangements for the school were completed, and notices were sent by the General Staff to the bandmasters of the entire AEF who had not come up to the necessary qualifications during the examination which I had given them, to report to the Chaumont School in batches of 50 every 8 weeks, beginning on October 1st, and to start their studies. Students for oboe, bassoon, French horn, and flugelhorn were also selected from the hundreds of applicants. At first we had great difficulty in finding the necessary instruments for them. France is famous for its woodwind instruments, but the various factories had long since ceased operations, as all the workmen were in the army. The ever-ready and ingenious Lieutenant Weil, however, succeeded in scraping together enough oboes and bassoons to start the classes, and I cannot say enough for the willing assistance which was accorded me by every United States Army officer with whom I came in contact, from the Commander-in-Chief down to Lieutenant Kelly, who sat in the anteroom of General Dawes's office in the Champs-Élysées, and whose principal duty seemed to be to ward off disagreeable or tiresome callers who wished to rob General Dawes of his valuable time. All made me feel as if the improvement of the army bands was the one thing necessary to win the war. It was high time for me to leave France and get back to earth, as I no longer walked on anything but air and with my head projecting far above the clouds. During my last visit to Chaumont, I motored down to Domremy, the birthplace of Jeanne d'Arc, and found the little village in just about the same state it must have been when she was born, in the little house next to the church, both of which have been carefully preserved for the worshippers of today. The open space in front of her house, the trees surrounding it, and the monument in the center seemed to me to form a natural stage on which a peace pageant could well be enacted. And as I sat there, and the bell began to toll from the little church in which Jeanne had whispered her prayers, I began to dream of a possible peace celebration in which a company of American soldiers, a company of French soldiers, an American and a French military band, singers from the Opéra Comique, and a children's chorus should take part, the climax to be the joyous meeting of the military forces around the monument and the awakening of Jeanne from her sleep of centuries, opening the door of her little house and standing there looking with astonishment at the unwonted sight of American soldiers in khaki as brothers of her beloved countrymen. On my return to Chaumont, I outlined this idea to several officers of the staff and of the French Commission, who received it with enthusiasm and promised every assistance, but alas, nothing ever came of it. When I returned to France the following spring, the armistice had been arranged and the Versailles Conference was dragging its weary and dreary deliberations toward an unsatisfactory conclusion. There did not seem to be enough illusion or enthusiasm left to celebrate anything international connected with the war. On my last visit to Chaumont, I gave a little dinner to Colonel Collins, Secretary of the Staff, whose constant interest had been invaluable, and whose mind seemed to be capable, at a moment's notice, of turning from the consideration of some intricate military problem to the great advantages to be derived from the introduction of the French B-flat bugle into our army. Over a very good magnum of champagne, I rose and made him, Colonel Boyd, and Lieutenant Weil solemnly swear that for the rest of the war, and as long thereafter as necessary, the bandmaster's school at Chaumont should be to them as the apple of their eye, and this oath they faithfully kept. The school flourished from October 1918 until June 1919, when it was discontinued owing to the return of our army to America. The relations between the French professors and our boys, all living together like a happy family, became so sympathetic and intimate that the results may truly be said to have been remarkable. The soldiers realized that they were receiving an education in music equal to that of the foremost schools of France or America, and the French professors professors entered into their duties with an enthusiasm which was touching. Cbteddy told me that many of his pupils worked at their musical problems 12 hours a day, and I urged him, in some way or other, to continue these pleasant and important international musical relations by founding a summer school somewhere in France, preferably near Paris, to which American men and women, already sufficiently advanced in their study of music, could repair for 3 months every summer in order to acquaint themselves with French art and French methods of teaching. Until the war began, hundreds of American students had gone to Germany every year, and it seemed a pity that, owing to the Frenchman's lack of propaganda for what his country could offer to our students, some of this stream could not be diverted to France. Our talks eventually led to the founding of the Conservatoire Américain at Fontainebleau, of which details are told in another chapter. By the courtesy of General Pershing, I received permission to leave for home on the Army Transport America. This ship sailed from Brest, and I was anxious to go there in order to see my daughter, Alice Pennington, once more. She and her friend, Miss Letty McKim, had been there for a year, and had founded the Naval YMCA to the great satisfaction of Admiral Wilson and our Navy stationed there. My daughter's enthusiasm and vitality, together with that of her equally able friend, had created an atmosphere which our sailors greatly relished, and I was keen to see some of her work. My train was to leave Paris in the evening, and my faithful friend and companion of the last 5 weeks, Lieutenant Weil, came to the station to bid me good-bye. There were no regular sleeping cars on this train, but only what the French call couchettes, 4 bunks in each compartment, 2 on each side. The names of the occupants were carefully written on a slip of paper and pasted on the outside of each door, and Lieutenant Weil informed me that a French general occupied the lower bunk opposite mine. Sure enough, a handsome youngish-looking general presently appeared, and politely touching his cap, entered our compartment and seated himself in his bunk. Weil, in French fashion, kissed me good-bye on both cheeks, and as I had still 10 minutes to spare, I stood outside and saw an American naval commander coming toward me with rather unsteady steps. He told me that he had had 36 hours leave, and that he and his 2 aides had decided to spend it by going to Paris. As the train took 12 hours each way, this gave them only 12 hours in the City of Delights, and he had evidently taken full advantage of every minute of it. He told me that his 2 aides had not yet turned up, that they had all the tickets and all his money. He also confided to me that one of them was so rich that he could have bought the entire train. I finally found his name on the list of our coupé, his bunk being directly over the French general's, and as it was getting late, I advised him to enter. Just at that moment, 2 handsome young naval lieutenants rushed up, and he received them with enthusiasm, for they had his railroad tickets. I helped him into our compartment, where he presently sat down right next to the general, who wrapped his cloak about him and cuddled up into his own corner. I said to my compatriot, "I think you are in the French general's bunk. Yours is the one above." Whereupon he said, "The French general can go to hell." I was frightened out of my wits, as I expected an immediate international encounter which might have the most serious consequences. Luckily, the general understood no English, and I finally induced my new naval friend to climb up into his own bunk, but I made a solemn vow that I would never again try to interfere where the Army and Navy of 2 different countries were concerned. I turned into my own bunk and slept well until next morning, when I found the commander also awake and possessed of a thirst which knew no bounds. There was, of course, no drinking water on the train, but I rushed him to the restaurant of the next station where we stopped, and he seized a carafe of water and put it to his lips with such avidity that you could almost hear the water sizzle as it passed down his throat. He turned out to be a delightful fellow. He was commander of a destroyer, and had spent dreary and terrible weeks in his little craft watching for submarines. The monotony and discomfort of such a life cannot be imagined, as these ships are so small that their motion is incessant, and they have to go out in the dirtiest of weather. There is hardly ever a chance to cook meals, and those on board must eat what and how they can. For weeks and weeks nothing happens, but my commander had had the good luck on his last trip to get a sub, and had received his 36 hours leave in consequence. Small wonder that he and his colleagues sought some relief in honor of the great event. At the next station, my French general and I got a cup of coffee. Sugar was at that time taboo, and as, thanks to my army friends, I had my pockets full of this precious stuff, I offered him some in place of the awful saccharin, which he accepted gratefully, and then told me that he was going on his first vacation in 2 years to spend with his family in a little watering resort this side of Brest. Sure enough, at the next station, as he got out, a charming boy and girl, browned by the sun, rushed up to him and fairly smothered him with kisses. It looked for all the world like a scene at a Long Island station in August, when the various New York fathers commute on a Friday afternoon to spend Saturday and Sunday with their families by the sea. I found my daughter Alice waiting for me at the station in Brest, and on the way to the little apartment which she and Miss McKim occupied together, she told me that Admiral Wilson wanted to meet me before my departure on the transport the same evening. She begged me to support her if he denounced jazz music, against which he had a particular hatred, for she had always insisted to him that the sailors loved it, and that in time of war they certainly should have anything they wanted. In the afternoon, the Admiral's band gave a concert in the public square, and I, of course, attended it and met the bandmaster and his players, who did very good work, several of them having been members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They begged me to conduct them in one of the numbers, and I took up the stick and solemnly played through the William Tell Overture with them. At the end, I saw Admiral Wilson on the balcony of his apartment, applauding vociferously, and he presently came running, bareheaded, across the square to greet me. Almost the first thing he said was, "Doctor, don't you think jazz music is horrible? It destroys all taste for real music." "Indeed, I heartily agree with you," I answered, whereupon my daughter Alice turned on me and said, "Coward," implying that as the Admiral was the autocrat of Brest, I did not wish to brave his wrath, even in order to please my daughter. But indeed I was thoroughly in accord with him, and I wish that either some popular substitute could be found for the interminable jazz that is ravaging not only our country but all Europe, or that a genius would come along who would pour into this very low form of art some real emotion which, welling from the very heart of man, might give life to what is at present but a nervous excitement. That evening I went on board the transport America and sailed for home. I found the voyage exceedingly interesting. The ship had been a Hamburg passenger liner, the America, taken over after her internment by our Navy, the K having been carefully removed and an American C substituted. Various German signs had been scratched out, but the table and bed linen, as well as the knives and forks, still bore the mystic initials HAPAG, Hamburg Amerika Paketfahrt Aktiengesellschaft. I was the proud occupant of a cabin and bathroom of the so-called Roosevelt suite, which the ex-president had occupied during his trip around the world, and the faucets over the bathtub still bore the signs Kalt, Warm, and Gemischt. The various luxurious furnishings of the ship showed the wear and tear of Army transport usage. The marble was cracked, and the electric bells did not ring. The first-class cabins were occupied by several hundred officers, a curious mixture of men, some returning on leave or to become instructors in the officers' camps, or being mustered out of service, either for ill health, drunkenness, or incompetence. For days I was pursued, even into my cabin, by a man from a western city who had enlisted as a dentist. He was evidently out of his mind, and was to be mustered out of the service on his return home. He had conceived the mysterious idea that I could influence the powers that be to have him reinstated, and I finally found the glitter in his eye so ominous that I reported him to the colonel in command, and he promptly had him put under medical observation. 2 days later, his companions in the hospital ward, whom he had already annoyed and frightened by suddenly grabbing their legs at night, found him in the bathroom with his throat partly cut by his razor, and I confess that I was glad when I heard that he had been put into a cabin by himself, with a soldier guarding the door. We were, of course, under Army regulations, and in many respects life was much stricter than on the passenger liners. We were compelled to wear life preservers almost the entire voyage, and no lights were permitted after sundown. We were not told at which American port we were to land, and I was much astonished one morning to find our ship anchored in Boston Harbor, alongside the old 1812 frigate Constitution, whose broadside guns looked delightfully picturesque and inefficient compared with the modern monsters I had seen in France. During the following winter, my wife and I often received visits from Navy officers and sailors bearing greetings from our daughter Alice in Brest, and I remember one red-cheeked youngster who made so agreeable an impression on my wife that she invited him to return the following day, which was Sunday, for luncheon. On that morning, the telephone rang. It was our old friend Admiral William Rogers, who asked whether he could come to luncheon. My wife said we would be delighted, but my youngest daughter Anita, who was well versed in the etiquette of the Navy, called out, "Oh, we can't have the Admiral lunching with us today. An admiral can't sit down at the same table with a gob." My wife repeated this to the admiral, who insisted that it made no difference, and that in wartime everything was possible, that he certainly wanted to come and would be very glad to meet the gob, who had brought greetings from Alice, of whom he was very fond. The sailor boy arrived first, and when we told him that our other guest was to be an admiral, he grew pale as death. But when Rogers arrived, he was so kind to the boy that luncheon passed off fairly well, except that the boy became rigid at attention whenever the admiral spoke to him. During the luncheon, Admiral Rogers said to him, "You have just seen Mrs. Pennington in Brest?" "Yes, sir." "And what was she doing when you saw her?" "She was selling postage stamps, sir," was the answer. And I have no doubt this was true, as Alice, in her capacity of naval Y-worker, not only took the sailors out to picnics with swimming contests, arranged vaudeville entertainments and concerts, but in between times sold them chocolate, cigarettes, postage stamps, picture postal cards, lemon drops, and ginger ale. After luncheon, my daughters discreetly took the young sailor into the front parlor in order to relieve the tension a little, and Rogers asked me about an orchestration of the Star-Spangled Banner, which I had made at the beginning of the war, and which had aroused some attention. I had always felt that this good old English tune had a fine ring to it, provided it was played in the proper tempo, and I had given it an orchestration which developed into quite a climax on the last two lines of each verse. I sat down at the piano and played it for him, explaining the difference between this version and the old one, which had been generally used before the war. He was much interested, and wanted to introduce it in the Navy. The sailor boy finally took his departure, and my daughters came smiling into the music room and told us that while they were sitting talking with a sailor, he suddenly jumped up from his chair and stood at rigid attention. He had heard the strains of the national anthem coming from our room, and, remembering the admiral, knew his duty. Who shall, after that, deny the power of music in peace or in war? End of section 20. Section 21 of my musical life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 16, The European Tour, Part 1. In the spring of 1919, I received a letter from Monsieur Lafayette, then Ministre des Beaux-Arts in France, which interested the directors of the New York Symphony Society and myself exceedingly. In this letter, he referred to the services of the New York Symphony Orchestra and myself to French art in America, and invited us to make a professional visit to France the following year. He promised every assistance from the French government and assured us of a warm welcome. Mr. Flagler immediately decided that this invitation must be accepted, inasmuch as it was the first time a foreign government had extended such a courtesy to an American musical organization. He also thought that our visit, coming so soon after the war, and including possibly the countries of the other allies in the war, such as Belgium, Italy, and England, would not only make a good impression, but would help to establish musical relations with Europe on a more equal basis. Up till then, the current had been all the other way. European singers and instrumentalists had been coming to America in a steady stream for many years, but in the meantime, America had developed several orchestras of her own, which could compare favorably with those of Europe. and he was very proud that the organization of which he was president and supporter should have been singled out for so great an honor and opportunity. I sailed for Europe in the spring of 1919 to confer with the Beaux-Arts about arrangements for our visit to Paris and other cities in France, and at the same time I also received invitations from the governments of Belgium and Italy to visit their countries with the orchestra. In London, Augustus Littleton, the publisher, head of the old house of Novello and Company, also received me very cordially, and insisted that our visit to Europe would not be complete if we did not include London. As England, like our country, has no Ministry of Fine Arts and can therefore take no official cognizance of musical affairs, he immediately and energetically set to work to form a committee of invitation, headed by King George and composed of all the foremost composers and conductors of Great Britain. Affairs began to shape themselves very favorably, and our manager, Mr. George Inglis, began to map out a tour of 7 weeks, during which we were to visit 5 countries and play, in all, 27 concerts. But in the meantime, foreign exchange sank lower and lower, and reports of transportation conditions in Europe were so gloomy that I began to be seriously doubtful of the possibility of the proposed tour in the spring of 1920. I finally decided in January to send our manager to Europe personally to look over the ground, and at the same time I expressed my fears to Mr. Flagler. I told him that we would have to pay enormous sums for traveling expenses, the item of steamer passage alone amounting to $50,000, and that while we would have to pay our orchestra salaries in American dollars, our receipts in Europe would be in francs, lira, etc. The dollar was then selling for 17 francs in France and for 23 lira in Italy. I suggested to him to postpone the tour until a time when war-torn Europe would be economically in a better condition and when her transportation system would again be more nearly on a pre-war basis. Mr. Flagler listened to me and said, "I do not see how we can possibly postpone the acceptance of these official invitations from 4 countries to a later period. Now is a psychological moment to do it. How much do you think the tour will cost?" I had made a kind of general calculation and mentioned the amount, which seemed to me large. "Isn't that curious?" he answered. "That is exactly what I thought it would cost. Go right ahead with your preparations." I was naturally delighted at his decision. I knew that American orchestras had achieved a perfection of ensemble which but few, if any, European orchestras could equal. I was proud of our organization and anxious to demonstrate it as a standard of American musical culture. The members of the orchestra were wild with excitement at the marvelous news. Many of them had been born in America and had never seen Europe. It was the wonderland of their imagination. Others had been there as soldiers during the war, and still others had left Europe years before to found their fortunes and families in the New World, and had not been back since. They immediately appointed a committee to agree upon a minimum salary schedule which, while giving them a fair recompense for their time, would yet make that part of it not too difficult for us. To this sum, however, Mr. Flagler later added $10 a week more for each player, as he thought that their hotel expenses might be greater than we had calculated. The managerial work of constructing the tour was beset with many difficulties, as the war had disorganized many of the regular concert organizations in Europe, under whose auspices we would have played under normal conditions. The railroads also made much slower time than formerly, but gradually the tour began to assume shape, and the first concert was scheduled to be given on May 6th at the Grand Opera in Paris, which the Ministère des Beaux-Arts had offered to us, and the last concert at the Royal Albert Hall in London on June 20th. In order that this tour might be representative in every way of the best in American music, Mr. Flagler suggested that we take along 2 young American-born soloists of distinction, Albert Spalding, violinist, and John Powell, composer-pianist. I immediately set to work to prepare a series of appropriate programs which would serve the double purpose of demonstrating the fine qualities of our orchestra and soloists, and also pay proper tribute to the great composers of the countries we proposed to visit. We were to open with 3 concerts in Paris, and as I was conversant with all the details in connection with Paris especially, I preceded the orchestra and arrived there April 22nd. At my hotel, the France et Choiseul, I found a letter from my old friend Robert Underwood Johnson, who had just left Paris to go to Rome as American ambassador to Italy. He said, "Dear Walter, it is pleasant to think that, within a few days, you will be occupying the ambassadorial suite in which I am writing these lines. Davis of London had it also. We leave day after tomorrow, and shall be very happy to see you all when you come to Rome. We are looking forward with pride and agreeable anticipation to the invasion of Italy by the symphony and its director and the assisting artists. We have no embassy, alas, being all dressed up, or nearly so, with no place to go to, and so we shall slum it at the Grand Hotel until the money seems to be giving out. Don't let any of your party perish by stumbling over the torn carpet at the entrance to this apartment. I have tried to have it mended, but my failure shows that I am no diplomat yet. Au revoir. Bientôt à Rome." My first act was to have that carpet mended, and I immediately sent a telegram to the American embassy in Rome announcing the important news. And then the affairs of the tour began to engulf me to such an extent that, until Mr. Inglis arrived and relieved me with able hands of a great deal of that burden, I thought that I was back again in the old days of the Damrosch Opera Company, when I was owner, director, orchestral conductor, stage manager, and prima donna pacificator all in one. To add to my worries, a railroad strike was announced for May 1st, the day on which the orchestra were to arrive at Le Havre, and not content with that, the dock workers of Le Havre intended also to lay down their tools, whatever they may be, and stop working on that date. When I thought of the musical instruments and trunks of my orchestra in the hold of the steamer Rochambeau, which was to arrive on or about May 1st, my heart stopped beating. However, I had been in too many close shaves on my great Western orchestral tours to be altogether dismayed, for even if the railroad stopped running, there would always be motor trucks and airplanes. We had made arrangements with Thomas Cook and Sons to take care of all transportation matters from the day the orchestra arrived in France until their sailing for home from England, and they assured me that, if necessary, they would have camions, such as were used during the war, to carry my whole orchestra, together with their baggage and musical instruments, from Le Havre to Paris. Luckily, the ship docked several hours before the dock workers' strike began, and double basses, kettle drums, and innumerable music boxes were safely landed from the hold of the ship. I had intended to go to Le Havre to meet the orchestra, but the strike conditions were too uncertain, and I thought it better to remain in Paris and direct operations from there. The government was moving several trains, and the telegram that the orchestra had started for Paris cheered me up considerably. I was at the station at 3:30 that afternoon, to be met with the news that the train was delayed and would be in at 6. At 6 there was no sign of it, and, as is usual at French stations, there was absolutely no one who had any idea when it might arrive. I stayed there till 8 o'clock, no train. Finally there was a whistle. Everyone dashed out. It was a freight train, but, like the dove from Noah's Ark, I saw the man from Cook's, a little man, attired then and during the entire tour, in a very small derby hat and an exceedingly long double-breasted frock coat, sitting on top of one of the cars. He was tired, dirty, but triumphant, for all our musical instruments and music boxes were in these cars. He had passed the orchestra halfway at Rouen, where they were held up by a hot box. This sounded like home to me, as I had heard those magic words only too often when our train, coming through Idaho or Arizona, on our way to or from California, would be held up for hours, and we would wonder whether we could make the concert that evening. The orchestra had rehearsed our repertoire with me so thoroughly before we sailed that but little more was necessary. I gave them 3 rehearsals, however, before our first concert, the first 2 at the Salle du Conservatoire, to shake them together again after their long voyage, and the last on the afternoon of the concert, May 6th, at the Opera House, in order to accustom them to its acoustics. The orchestra played so superbly at the 2 first rehearsals that I was jubilant and proud of them. The ensemble was perfect, and each man played as if the success of the concert depended on him, which it certainly did. But when we began rehearsing at the Opera House, the tone of the orchestra suddenly seemed so thin and lifeless that I was nearly beside myself with anxiety. The orchestra was placed on the stage, but the local management had not seen fit to provide us with any proper scenic setting or roof, so that the sound of our large and noble orchestra was completely dissipated in the flies. When I remonstrated, I was told that they had a roof for the stage, but that it was in the storehouse, situated beyond the fortifications of Paris, and that this was the first time in many years the opera house had been used for a concert. They finally agreed to have at least half a roof up for our concert and to set a smaller scene, which would contain the sound and throw it into the audience room in more compact fashion. After 20 minutes or so of rehearsing, I threw down my stick and told the men to call it a day. I went back to my hotel very depressed, as so much depended on the first impression which our orchestra would make that evening. The program was as follows: 1. Overture Benvenuto Cellini, Berlioz. 2. Symphony No. 3, Eroica, Beethoven. 3. Istar, Variation Symphonique, Dandy. 4. Daphnis et Chloe, Fragments Symphoniques, Ravel. The reader will notice that we placed on it 2 works by living French composers, both of whom were to be at the concert. The house was completely sold out, and greeted me in very friendly fashion when I came on the stage. From the very first chords of the Eroica Symphony, I noticed that the slight improvements in our scenic surroundings, and above all the fact that the house was filled with people, had acted like magic on the acoustics. The tone of the orchestra had become full, clear, and incisive. My spirits rose, and I forgot everything except the orchestra before me and Beethoven's score. After each movement, the applause was deafening, and at the end of the symphony there was joyous shouting from the galleries. We seemed to have played our way into their hearts, and after the first part there was a steady stream of French musicians to my dressing room to congratulate me on our marvelous orchestra and its ensemble, and to express their delight that we had come over on such a friendly mission. Among them were Vincent Dandy, Gabriel Fauré, André Messager, Gabriel Pirnet, Theodore Dubois, Paul Vidal, Nadia Boulanger, and many others. As we turned into the French part of our program, the enthusiasm became still greater, and at the conclusion of Istar, some of my first violins discovered the composer, Dandy, in the audience and, pointing toward him, stood up to applaud. In a minute, not only the whole orchestra, but the audience were on their feet, and with loud cries of "Auteur! Dandy!" the house was in an uproar until Dandy, his face as red as a beet, was compelled to rise and acknowledge this tribute. The program finished with the marvelous Daphnis et Chloe by Ravel, in which the luscious tone of the orchestra and its virtuosity demonstrated themselves so successfully that not only did the concert come to a tumultuous climax, but several of the French papers announced afterward that this work had never had such a vivid and perfect rendering before. My interpretation of the Beethoven Eroica Symphony puzzled some of the newspaper critics, as it did not conform to their French traditions. These do not permit such slight occasional modifications of tempo as modern conductors brought up in the German traditions of Beethoven believe essential to a proper interpretation of this master. But I was much pleased and honored to receive a complete approval of my interpretation, not only verbally from several of my French colleagues, but also from M. Dandy in an article which he wrote on our concert, and in which he said, "Leaving aside everything that Walter Damrosch has done for our country and the French musicians, generous acts for which our gratitude has often been expressed, I wish mainly to pay my tribute to the extremely expressive interpretation at the concerts he has given lately at the opera. Whether it is classical, romantic, or modern music, Damrosch first of all endeavors to set off and illustrate what we call the meloche, the element of expression, the voice that must rise above all the other voices of the orchestra. He knows how to distribute the agogic action, the dynamic power, and he is not afraid, even in Beethoven's works, and in spite of the surprise this caused to our public, to accelerate or slacken the movement when the necessities of expression demand it. The French are a courteous people, and at the end of the concert there was an even greater crowd of musicians and friends behind the scenes to express their pleasure at our success. The programs of the other 2 concerts were as follows: May 8th, 1. Overture Le Roi 10, Lalo. 2. Symphony from the New World, Dvorak. 3. Concerto for Violin and Orchestra in B minor, Saint-Saëns, Mr. Spalding. 4. A. Pélias et Mélisande, Fileuse, Fauré. B. Ma Mère Loire, Les Pagodes, Ravel. 5. Prelude to D Meistersinger, Wagner. May 9th. 1. Symphony in C, Jupiter, Mozart. 2. Poème d'après Verlaine, Loeffler. 3. Symphony in D minor, Franck. 4. Negro Rhapsody for Piano and Orchestra, Powell, John Powell. The two young American artists, Albert Spalding and John Powell, made a splendid impression, and of the orchestral works, the prelude to the Meistersingers of Wagner and the Mozart and Franck symphonies received special acclaim. It was delightful to hear the half-suppressed ahs and bravos so characteristic of a French audience after the andante of the Mozart symphony. I confess that the more spontaneous approval which European audiences give in drama, opera, or concert is exceedingly gratifying and stimulates the artist to the very best that is in him. Every artist who is worth his salt will always approach an audience with the feeling that they are as strangers whom through his art he must win over as friends. This feeling exists whether he makes his first bow as a beginner or appears for the 3,000th time after 20 years of public work. It is a wonderful moment for him when, after having done his best and given all there is in him, his audience show by the intensity of their approval that the song which he breathed into the air has found its home in the heart of a friend. On Sunday morning, May 9th, at 11, the orchestra of the Conservatoire gave a great party in our honor as a return courtesy for one that we had given to the French orchestra on their arrival in America in 1918. We all met at the Salle du Conservatoire, where Monsieur Léon, representing the Ministry of Fine Arts, was waiting to receive me. With the Conservatoire Orchestra were various French masters, including the Venerable Gabriel Fauré and Messager, the conductor. After various speeches of welcome, I was presented with a beautiful engraving of Beethoven and made an honorary member of the Conservatoire Orchestra. We then marched to the Taverne du Negre, where luncheon was served. There were so many different kinds of wine glasses before each plate that I asked permission to make a short speech in English to my orchestra. It consisted of the following: "Gentlemen, remember we have a concert this afternoon, so please mix your wine with much water." Needless to say, in all the speeches the theme of the war was constantly played upon by the French orators, how much France owed to our intervention and to the bravery of our soldiers. It would have been very pleasant to stay on in Paris, where our orchestra were beginning to feel very much at home, and rest upon our young laurels, but our tour had only begun, and we had to carry on. In the meantime, Mr. Inglis and our treasurer, Roger Townsend, had to smooth out all kinds of new difficulties and complications, among which the passport nuisance was the greatest. War conditions still prevailed, and passports had to be carefully visaed by the ambassadors of every country we visited. All our orchestra were practically Americans, but technically they belonged to America, France, Belgium, Italy, England, Russia, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Many of them had had only their first American papers when the war broke out, and according to war regulations could not yet obtain their American citizens' papers. They were therefore compelled to travel on foreign passports, and some of their visas were exceedingly difficult to obtain, as new countries like Czechoslovakia, for instance, had not yet a properly organized diplomatic service. Others, like Russia, were not recognized at all, and our Russians had to travel on Kerensky passports, issued for them by the Kerensky ambassador, who was still holding the fort in Washington. Through the kindly help of Mr. Grew, counselor at our embassy in Paris, and other friends in high places, we finally obtained our 100 visas and left Paris for Bordeaux on May 11th, and, in spite of the railroad strike, with the passage of our train assured as far as Bordeaux. The only fly in the ointment was a little revolution before we left the station. Some of the members of the orchestra had brought their wives and even a few small children to Europe with them. They very naturally desired to give their families a good time and wanted to have them with them and in the orchestra cars on the entire trip. As railroad space was exceedingly limited, and the bachelor and straw widower members of the orchestra strenuously objected to this addition, I had to veto the plan, and painted the difficulties of travel, hotels, passports, etc., in such lurid fashion that I succeeded in preventing their departure from Paris with us. The husbands promised to leave their families in Paris until our return, about 3 weeks later, but as all the wives and children came to the station to see their respective husbands and fathers off, I was nervous until the last doors of the car were slammed to and the whistle of the French locomotive, which always sounds like the shrill wail of the damned, announced that we were really off. The orchestra were in a very gay mood, and insisted on getting out every time the train stopped even a second, and then having to be pulled back as the train started again without any warning. A passport picture of one unfortunate little second violinist was sent through all the cars, pasted on a piece of paper with the inscription, "Wanted for bigamy, member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, reward of 3 francs if returned dead or alive to George Inglis, manager." This had been perpetrated by Willem Billicke, who is not only a master violoncellist, but the mastermind behind almost every practical joke indulged in during the tour. We arrived in Bordeaux that evening and were welcomed at our hotel by a typical little hotel manager, with his head entirely bald on top, but beautifully covered, with the long hair combed forward from the back of his head. He also had a full beard, neatly parted in the middle, and of course a long double-breasted frock coat. He rubbed his hands with the pleasure of welcoming us and assured us that all our rooms were properly reserved. Actually, it took us 3/4 of an hour to get ourselves and our baggage straightened out in the proper rooms. Our party consisted of Albert and Mrs. Spaulding, John Powell, Mary Flagler, my daughter Gretchen, and myself, and the highly efficient manager had sent each one of us at first to the wrong rooms, while our bags had still further gone astray. But a good bath and a delicious dinner at the famous Chapon Fin put us all in good humor. The theater at which we were to play the following evening was directly opposite to our hotel, and its frontal facade is without doubt the most beautiful I have ever seen. Such examples of the finest architecture of the 18th century stand out in remarkable contrast to their more modern surroundings, and it is difficult to understand how French architects, with such noble examples to follow, and with a school in Paris, which is still considered the best in the world, should have allowed their art to degenerate to such an extent within the last 30 years. One has but to compare the noble facade of the Place de la Concorde with such modern monstrosities as, for instance, the Hotel Mercedes or the Palais de Justice at Tours, to realize that in their endeavor to break away completely from their own noblest traditions, they have deliberately courted anarchy, for their architecture rests upon no laws of beauty or symmetry. Many of our best American architects are graduates from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, but they have not become revolutionaries and have understood how to adapt their appreciation of the best French traditions to American needs. The results demonstrate an art of which every American can be proud. Our concert, which was given under the auspices of the local symphony society, was received with great favor. The interior of the theater is delightfully intimate, and the audience gave the impression of belonging to an old musical civilization. We were presented with huge bouquets of flowers, tied with the American colors. Albert Spaulding's performance made a splendid impression, and the Meistersinger overture came in for special enthusiasm. But what was my astonishment at suddenly beholding 3 of the orchestral wives, who were supposed to have remained in Paris, seated in one of the boxes. I do not know to this day whether they rode on the bumpers or in one of the baggage cars. However, they were charming ladies, and, as a married man, I could not be too angry with them or their indulgent husbands. We compromised in the matter by permitting them to continue with us for the rest of the tour, provided that they and their husbands occupied space elsewhere than that reserved for the orchestra, and that they looked out for their own passports whenever we approached the border. As we returned to our hotel after the concert, the smiling hotel manager stood in the lobby to receive us and to express his congratulations at the success of a concert merveilleux. As we entered the electric lift to go to our respective rooms, he himself shut the grating on us and pressed the button to send us slowly upward. All French lifts move slowly. Its almost celestial calmness irresistibly brought the finale of Gounod's Faust to my mind when Marguerite ascends heavenward. I began to sing the melody of the Ange Radieux, and just as we got up to the first floor, we suddenly heard the voice of the hotel manager, a vibrant tenor, enthusiastically continuing the trio from below. I gazed downward, and there he was, his face raised ecstatically toward us, and his hand pressed to his double-breasted frock coat, perhaps a poor hotel manager, but certainly an enthusiastic lover of music. The newspapers of Bordeaux were full of praise about our concert, but one of them said the orchestra played with that dryness characteristic of all North Americans. Alack and alas, had the 18th Amendment, which went into effect the previous January, already made its dreadful influence felt? Lyon was to be the next city on our itinerary, but unfortunately the railroad strike had completely isolated it, and there was no way of reaching it from Bordeaux. We were therefore very reluctantly compelled to cancel the concert. Every seat had been sold long before, and as Lyon ranked next to Paris in musical importance, the cancellation was a great disappointment to us. End of section 21. Section 22 of my musical life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 16, The European Tour, Part 2. The next morning, Inglis brought me a telegram, which he had just received from our general manager in Paris, to the effect that at Marseille, the hall in which we were to play had been condemned by the fire department as unsafe, and that therefore the concert would have to be given at another theater and under different management. Inglis did not like the look of things and begged me, as he could not speak French, to go with him to Marseille and look over the ground with him. We were to have played in Marseille under the auspices and management of the local symphonic organization, which, however, turned out to be but a small and not very influential body of musicians, most of whom were amateurs. Their secretary, who was to attend to the details of management, was a newspaper man and an amateur double bass player, of which instrument he was very proud. When we arrived, only 2 days before the concert, we found that absolutely nothing had been done to advertise it. There were no posters, no advertisements, and the manager of the theater to which we had been transferred did not even know before our arrival whether we were a jazz band of colored people from America or perhaps a troupe of wandering minstrels. We were to give 2 concerts, and at first it seemed as if, under such disheartening circumstances, it were better to cancel them and proceed to Monte Carlo and Italy, where already sold-out houses awaited us. The newspaper man, who was the real delinquent, was nowhere to be found. He had gone to the country pour se reposer, and was not expected until the following day. Luckily, the theater manager proved to be of the right sort. When he saw what our organization really stood for, he would not hear of cancellation, and immediately went around to all the newspaper offices with Inglis. Posters, the principal method of advertising in Europe, appeared on the street corners as if by magic, and while it was too late to attract a large audience for the first concert, he assured us that if this concert were the success which he expected, the theater, which held about 2,400 people, would be entirely sold out for the second concert on Sunday afternoon. His prophecy proved correct. There were not more than 800 people at the first concert, but as they were real sons of the Midi, and as they had never heard a symphonic organization of such size and importance in their lives, they went mad. They applauded with their hands, with both feet, with their canes and umbrellas. They shouted in 8-part harmonies, and the rafters of the theater trembled in sympathy. After the concert, they lined up at the box office in a great crowd, while the theater manager, grinning from ear to ear, said, "Did I not tell you?" In the meantime, the delinquent local secretary manager turned up, and I was fully prepared to annihilate him for his lack of proper preliminary advertising for our concert, but as he immediately called me cher maître and expressed his delight in such eloquent French at the coming of so notable an organization as ours, he completely spiked my guns, and I found myself unable to get in a word edgewise, much less tell him what I really thought of him. I have told before that he was an amateur double bass player in the local orchestra, and this was evidently the ruling passion of his life, although I never could understand why an amateur should choose this particular instrument for his delectation. After the second concert, and while the hall was still ringing with the shouts of the fiery citizens of Marseille, he came into my dressing room, as I thought, to add his tribute of praise, but alas, all he said was, cher maître, I could hardly hear your double bass players during the entire concert. I presume that at the concerts of his orchestra he was so taken up with his own double bass part that as he played he heard nothing of the other instruments around and about him. He became, so to speak, intoxicated with the resonance of his own instrument. At our concert, seated in the audience, he suddenly found, poor man, that the double bass was not the only pebble on the orchestral beach, and that occasionally the violins, the woodwinds, or the brasses had also something of importance to enunciate. It must have been a sad revelation to him, and I do not wonder that he refused to accept it. In the meantime, the strike fever was spreading in every direction, and there was not a trolley running through the town of Marseille, nor a boat leaving the harbor. The effect was a very curious one, as the streets were filled with great crowds restlessly moving up and down, and seemingly without work or affairs of any kind to keep them busy. In several of the streets, small bands were playing in roped-off circles, while 30 couples or so were dancing madly around with hundreds of others outside the ropes watching them. The huge audience who arrived for our Sunday afternoon concert must have come on foot, as there was not a wheel turning anywhere. After we got back to the hotel, the great iron doors were suddenly closed and bolted, for quite a riot started in front of it. The trolley company was trying to run a car through the city, manned by young mechanics from the School of Technology, and every once in a while a mob of strikers would rush at them, break the windows of the car, and pull off the young strike-breakers. But it was all done in rather an amiable fashion, while a crowd of men in light straw hats applauded with their hands and shouted bravo, all as if it were a performance gotten up for their pleasure. Then a couple of amiable gendarmes would come along, and in the same placid fashion place the young men on the car again, which would then proceed for another few yards or so. Suddenly, however, the seeming comedy took a tragic turn. The mob made a vicious lunge. They were stopped by the police, who suddenly acted with great energy, and soon there were several men seriously hurt. In the meantime, the strike-breakers had again connected their car with the electric wire, and although the car with its broken windows looked a perfect wreck, it moved triumphantly along the tracks, and the strike was broken. Next morning, every car was running again. Later that afternoon, I received a visit from Morris Tiven, the first double bass player of our orchestra. He brought with him a boy of 15, a little Russian Jew, who had a most remarkable history. He had escaped from a prison in Russia and worked his way to Constantinople. As he was a violinist of exceptional ability, he had made a meager living there playing in the cafes. Having read in some old Paris paper that we were to give a concert in Marseille, he had quickly made up his mind to get there and perhaps through our help reach the promised land of America. He arrived in Marseille as a stowaway after incredible hardships, and when he introduced himself to some of his Russian compatriots in my orchestra, he was literally starving and without a cent in his pockets. Within a few hours, our orchestra had subscribed enough money to send him to New York, with several letters to their colleagues at the Musical Union, and within a week after his arrival, he was engaged as second concertmaster at a large salary in one of our Western orchestras. The generous spirit displayed by our men, which demonstrated itself in so quick and practical a fashion, is characteristic of the rank and file of our profession. I have never known a case of an orchestra musician or chorus singer in need that his colleagues were not immediately ready to help. and as their own earnings are comparatively small, their generosity is much greater in proportion than that of many a rich man, whose name figures largely among the subscribers to our charitable organizations. Our next concert was to be in Monte Carlo, and I motored with my wife from Marseille along the Riviera, reaching Monte Carlo on the evening of May 17th. The orchestra had already arrived by train and were to be found all over the town, photographing points of interest, especially the beautiful statue erected to Hector Berlioz, which we were all glad to honor. Every orchestra musician adores this great master, who in his scores has done more than any other to develop new tone combinations in the symphonic orchestra since Beethoven and before Wagner. A great many of our men naturally went to the casino to behold the world-famous gambling tables, but if I ever had any worries about their squandering their earnings, they quite disappeared. Many only watched at the outer edge, or else bet one chip very timidly. An aged harpy, who looked as though she had played at Monte Carlo since the time of Napoleon III, and who kept a notebook of her losses and winnings, and never bet less than 100 francs at a time, took it upon herself to teach one of our talented young flute players how to play with one white chip. She kept him in a state of the most panting thrills, while she placed his bets for him. The next morning I found a note from Jean de Reschke telling me that he, his wife, and Amherst Weber would motor over from Nice for the concert, and asking my wife and me to lunch with him at the Grand Hotel de Paris, where we were staying. It was such a joy to see him again. We had not met since 1902, when he had been at the Metropolitan, at the height of his fame, and I had conducted many a glorious Tristan performance with him in the title role. Amherst Weber, a highly talented English musician, had then been with him as pianist, and I had helped him a little with his studies in composition and instrumentation. Madame de Reschke I had never had the pleasure of meeting before. A great tragedy had come upon her, as their only son had been killed in the first year of the war. It was heartbreaking to see her, as her face told the story of her irreparable loss. The concert in the afternoon took place in the exquisite little theater at the casino. It seats only about 400 people, and of course every seat was occupied. Jean de Reschke was in the 5th row of the parquet, and as I came to the prize song in the Meistersinger Overture, which he had sung so often and so ravishingly in New York, I could not help but turn around to look at him. He gave me an immediate smile, but the tears were running down his face. At the close of the concert, I was solemnly informed by the very polite little intendant of the theater that Monsieur Blanc, the principal owner of the casino, the opera, the gambling tables, the Hotel de Paris, in fact everything which draws the 100-franc notes from the grateful tourist, had expressed a desire to meet me and to thank me for the concert exquis. I was accordingly piloted to another part of the building where, in an anteroom, 5 or 6 people were waiting as if in a doctor's outer office, while flunkies in livery were silently walking around or delivering whispered messages to this or that man. One of these approached my little intendant with a message, who turned to me and with a face radiant with pride said, "Think of it, he will see us first before all the others." We followed the flunky into an inner room, where I found a tired-looking, gray-mustached little man whom I had noticed sleeping in one of the boxes during about half an hour of the concert. He congratulated me on the splendid concert and the exquisite playing of the orchestra, and as I sat there I marveled at it all. Here was a man whom we in America would call a gambling housekeeper, but he is certainly a king among them. He has provided his gambling tables with a setting so exquisite that words cannot describe it. Nature in her most charming mood, beautiful architecture, delightful music, exquisite cooking, all these so skillfully combined as to create an agreeable atmosphere for the thousands who come every year with full pockets and generally leave with empty ones. Incidentally, he makes millions by thus cleverly pandering to the gambling instincts which are inherent in almost every man and woman. To me, the most delightful feature of the concert, except of course the visit of Jean de Reschke, was a large audience of 75 who sat behind the scenes as there was no room for them in front. They were the orchestra of the Monte Carlo Opera, an excellent body of men who embraced us in true Southern fashion between the parts and at the end of the concert. The next morning I continued the trip by motor to Genoa. As there had been no strike of any kind in Monte Carlo, I thought that our hoodoo had lifted, but lo and behold, at Genoa we found only one old, gray-bearded portier at our hotel to greet us. All the waiters, porters, chambermaids, cooks, scullions, in fact everything that could strike in connection with a hotel, were on strike, and the discomfort was considerable. We had looked forward with pleasurable anticipation to our first Italian dinner. We had dreamed of fritto misto, spaghetti, and of delicious Italian ices, but these dreams quickly vanished. There was not even a crust of bread to be obtained at the hotel. Finally, we were furtively conducted through an alley into the back entrance of a little restaurant by way of the kitchen, and there we obtained some food, but of the simplest and poorest variety. The next morning a cup of wretched coffee and a piece of stale bread at the railroad station made our breakfast, but luckily for us a kind young American, Mr. Allen, called on us and whisked us off in his car to his house, where a delicious luncheon made us forget our deprivations of the night before. I was again amazed at the cleverness with which the members of our orchestra adapted themselves to European traveling conditions. They had all found excellent restaurants and had really fared much better than we. We gave our concert at the Teatro Carlo Felice, and our first Italian audience proved to be even more noisy in their demonstrations of pleasure than the Midi. I was very much touched to receive a large wreath tied with the Stars and Stripes from the American Consul General, who told me after the concert that he considered such a cultural mission as we were engaged in of as much importance for cordial relations between our country and Italy as any business enterprise. He said that music meant so much to the Italian that he was amazed and delighted to find that Americans did not only interest themselves in business, but also cultivated the arts. As the Italians had been so bitterly disillusioned regarding President Wilson after the phenomenally enthusiastic acclaim which they had given him on his visit to Rome only a year before, I was not surprised to have one old gentleman say to me after the concert, "We do not like your president, but we love the Americans." We left next morning by train for Rome. The highly talented young composer, Signor Vincenzo Tomasini, had interested himself in our concerts there and had enlisted the sympathies of the Accademia Santa Cecilia, under whose auspices we were to play at the Augustale. The Santa Cecilia, which is composed of musicians and music lovers, is perhaps the oldest musical organization in the world, as it was founded by Palestrina. Under the presidency of Count San Martino, it maintains a symphony orchestra which gives a series of concerts during the winter under its own conductor, Maestro Molinari, and various guest conductors. All these concerts are given at the Augustale, so called because it was built by Augustus as a tomb for the Caesars. It is a rotunda built of the old Roman bricks, but balconies, a stage, and an organ have been added to it in recent times to adapt it to modern concert needs. It very likely was an excellent tomb, but its acoustics are hardly suited for an orchestra. I do not know of any concert hall built in circular shape that is satisfactory in that respect. The sound vibrations seem to travel around and around, and great confusion of tones is the result, especially in such music where changing harmonies succeed each other rapidly. At our little preliminary rehearsal, the hall was empty, with the exception of half a dozen members of the Santa Cecilia, and as we began to play through a few bars of the symphony, I thought I had suddenly become deaf, as the sound of the orchestra did not reach me where I stood. But I remembered our first experience at the Grand Opera House in Paris, and trusted to better conditions when the hall was full. This hope was justified, as the tone of the orchestra was much clearer and better balanced at the concert. After the first and second movements of the Eroica Symphony, there were great applause and shouts of bravo from the boxes and parquet, but this was immediately followed by very disconcerting whistling from the top gallery, which seemed to develop into a kind of duel between the two factions. I was somewhat disconcerted at this, and thought that perhaps something in our playing had not pleased the galleries, but my friends of the Accademia Santa Cecilia assured me that this was nothing but a characteristic little demonstration which often occurred at their concerts. If the parquet and boxes approved of some particular composition or rendition, the galleries felt it incumbent upon them to oppose it. I do not know how true this explanation is, but during the concert the whistling suddenly ceased, and after the Ricardo Wagner Tristan e Isolde, Preludio e Morte di Isolde, Lipsia 1813-Venezia 1883, as the Italian program had it, the two factions seemed to have buried their hatchets completely and were in absolute harmony as far as their enthusiastic acclaim toward us was concerned. During the 2 days following, the Romans overwhelmed us with hospitalities. The heat was terrific, but the entire orchestra responded to an invitation to be presented to the mayor and to visit the Capitoline Museum, where they were offered a private view of its art treasures, followed by a luncheon given by the municipality in the adjoining ruins of the Tabularium. On the following morning, Tomasini, Molinari, and a few others of my musician colleagues sauntered into my salon and suggested that we go to a concert given that morning at the Borghese Gardens by the famous Banda Comunale di Roma. The heat was so overwhelming that I shuddered at the idea of standing under the blazing noonday sun listening to a concert, especially as I had to conduct our own second concert on that afternoon. "Please come," said Tomasini. "No, indeed," I said. "It is far too hot, and I want to do good work this afternoon. But the concert is given in your honor. Good gracious, why didn't you tell me that immediately? Come along." I grabbed my hat, and we drove to the Borghese Gardens, where a crowd of several thousand people were gathered around the bandstand, and where Maestro Vicella was conducting his band in a beautiful rendition of the prelude to Wagner's Parsifal. It was a wonderful performance. His clarinets played the opening unison phrase with a vibrant and singing quality that I have rarely heard equaled, and I was struck by the rapt silence with which the huge audience of Italians listened to it. I, unfortunately, arrived too late to hear the rendition of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which Vicella himself had arranged for a military band, and which my musicians afterward told me had been beautifully performed. The concert came to a close with a selection of airs from one of the popular modern Italian operas. To my astonishment and delight, as the band began to play this or that air, evidently well known to the audience, groups of men around the bandstand joined in singing it with the orchestra mezza voce, but with that perfect quality of tone which is inborn in the Italian race. And then, as the sounds of one group would die out, another from the other side would take it up, and this continued until the end of the number. It was a delightful demonstration of the innate musical genius of the Italian people. I forgot temporarily that the sun was blazing down with a fierceness almost unendurable, but after I had thanked Maestro Vicella for this truly wonderful concert, I begged Molinari and Tomasini to take me back to my hotel. "Stay a little while longer," said Tomasini. "Impossible," I answered. "I am melting away, and there will be nothing left of me if I do not get to some shaded spot soon." "Oh, but you will," he said. "The Banda Comunale are now going to present you with the gold medal of the Society, with a special inscription." "Why in heaven's name did you not tell me this sooner?" I said to my friend, but he simply smiled his inscrutable Italian smile and lit another cigarette. With the resolve to do or die, I marched along with them to a private room in a restaurant adjoining the gardens, and there ices and vermouth were served to the members of the two musical organizations, and I was presented with a gold Roman medal, which I treasure very highly as coming from so remarkable a body of players as the Banda Comunale di Roma. For some years I have been interested in the new musical development that is going on in Italy. There had been a period when her church music led the world in the variety and beauty of its form. Later on, especially in the 18th century, she had produced many composers of distinction in instrumental music, but from then on and until very recent times, opera had almost completely monopolized her writers. The splendid opera houses, which are to be found in her smallest towns, are eloquent testimony to the important place which that form of art occupies in the hearts of the Italian people. Every Italian can sing, and the critics and lovers of opera are to be found just as much among the poorer classes as among the aristocracy. But all the testimony of older musicians with whom I have spoken and who have traveled through Italy is to the effect that her orchestras formerly were of a very poor quality. Their playing was slovenly and rehearsals few and insufficient. Many of the players in the opera houses of even the larger cities followed some other calling in the daytime, and there was many a tailor or shoemaker who played his violin in the evening at the opera. Within the last 25 years, however, a complete and almost miraculous change has come over musical conditions throughout Italy. Its conservatories in Rome, Milan, Bologna, and Naples turn out excellent players, and several of her conductors rank with the best of other countries. Signor Mancinelli, for instance, who was my colleague during the years that I conducted at the Metropolitan for Maurice Grau, was a first-class musician and conductor, well versed in more than Italian music. He was a great lover of Mozart and gave beautiful performances of the magic flute at the Metropolitan. He envied me my job of conducting the Wagner operas, and later on conducted many of them in Italy and Spain. Toscanini is one of the greatest conductors living today. His range extends to the music of all countries, and I have heard him conduct Mozart's Don Giovanni, Verdi's Falstaff, and Wagner's Meistersinger in 1 week, with equal penetration into their beauties, and, incidentally, without an orchestral score in front of him. He has made a virtue of necessity, as he is almost blind, and has therefore developed his power of memory to a greater extent than I have ever seen in any other musician, not even excepting Hans von Bülow. The result of Italy's more serious attitude toward instrumental music shows itself not only in the quality of Italian orchestras, but in a group of highly talented young composers who devote their principal efforts to symphonic music and who are creating works that rank with the best that other countries are now producing. Several years ago, I produced an orchestral suite written by a boy of 16, Victor di Sabata, which showed remarkable talent and fine orchestral coloring. Such men as Respighi, Sinigaglia, Tomasini, Casella, Pizzetti, and Malapiero have found frequent places on our programs, and I expect still further contributions, constantly growing in importance, from this new development of the musical genius of Italy. I was much touched by the interest which our ambassador, Mr. Johnson, constantly showed in our success and well-being. He had invited the Queen Mother and several of the young princesses to our concerts, and at the many official and governmental functions which I had to attend, he was a sympathetic companion and real brother artist. He always responded very felicitously when occasion demanded, and all my Italian musician friends loved him. At a farewell supper which I gave on the last night, John Powell, whose Negro fantasy had interested our Italian audiences greatly, and the composer Malapiero sat next to each other, but as John speaks English and Malapiero Italian and French, the silence between them for about 10 minutes was deep and profound. Suddenly they broke into the most fluent conversation, and the words burst forth in torrents. They had suddenly discovered, to their mutual delight, that the German language was a common meeting ground. I left Rome very reluctantly. Quite apart from the many personal friends that I had made there, its eternal beauty again enveloped me and bade me stay. I cannot imagine any movement or institution better calculated to help young American artists to further develop and stimulate their creative abilities than the American Academy in Rome. It has quite recently added 3 music fellowships to those for painters, sculptors, architects, and archaeologists. And, as it has done me the honor to elect me as one of the trustees, and the still greater honor of giving my name to one of the music fellowships, I revisited Rome in the spring of 1922, especially to observe the workings of our academy. I was amazed and delighted beyond words. The academy is intended for young artists who have already acquired the technique of their profession. They are selected by competition and are given absolute freedom from bread worries for 3 years, the first 2 of which they spend at the home of the academy, the Villa Aurelia. During the 3rd year, they may travel or live anywhere in Europe where they think their artistic aims can be further advanced. Rome and its surroundings are so romantic, and its art treasures so unique, that the perception of beauty and its crystallization into works of art cannot fail to be further stimulated in those of our American boys who have the good fortune to achieve a fellowship. It is, of course, impossible for any man-made institution to guarantee that every incumbent will develop into a great genius, but it is certain that as only the best are chosen, they will become still better through such happy 3 years. And if among every 200 only one real genius is found, and thus encouraged, the Academy will have justified its existence. 2 of our music fellows had already arrived at the Academy, Leo Sowerby of Chicago and Howard Hanson of San Jose, California, and had immediately, with characteristic American energy, made themselves part and parcel of Roman musical life. The Italian musicians had welcomed them with open arms, and our boys were constantly found at the concerts and rehearsals of the Santa Cecilia, or having some of their Italian musician friends at the Villa Aurelia for chamber music and a cup of tea in the beautiful gardens surrounding the villa. America owes a great debt of gratitude to Major Felix Lamond, through whose single-mindedness of purpose and energy the fund has been collected, which has made the 3 music fellowships possible. He is now continuing the work by giving his life to the music department of the Academy, and as its director acts as guide, counselor, and friend to its young incumbents. I must confess that during my visit I had the constant yearning that I might be 40 years younger and could spend 3 wonderful years in Rome under such ideal conditions. The last night, Major Lamond, his wife, and I dined on the roof of the Villa Aurelia with Director Stevens, who is in supreme charge of the entire Academy. According to Roman custom, dinner began after 9 o'clock. Beneath us, and stretching out toward the Campagna, was the entire city of Rome, with its electric lights appearing like magic in every direction. Beyond the Campagna rose the mountains, still visible in the faint twilight. Opposite to us rose the hill of the Pincio Gardens, and on the left, just visible over the treetops, flamed the cross of St. Peter's. The silence was profound until suddenly the bells of Rome began to vibrate from all directions, and finally, faint but clear, came the sound of a bugle from the military barracks, blowing the retreat. By this time I was sunk in a silent ecstasy, but a further climax was yet in store for me, for as the last notes of the bugle trembled into silence, a nightingale from the bushes directly below us began to pour forth her song. Florence came next on our orchestral tour, and I looked forward with eagerness after our crowded days of official receptions and concerts to a day absolutely free from duties of any kind. We arrived on May 24th, and I hoped to sleep deep and late, but at 9 o'clock next morning there was a knock at my door, and without any further preliminary warning in walked a young gentleman who introduced himself as the representative of the mayor of Florence, who sends regrets that he cannot be here himself, but wishes me to give Maestro Damrosch the speech of welcome. I begged him to excuse me for a few minutes, and attired myself so that I could receive the mayor's kind welcome in a more fitting garb and room. Our concert was at the splendid Politeama Theater, a great amphitheater with fine acoustics. Albert Spalding was our soloist, and as he had been virtually brought up in Florence, and the people there had watched his career with eager interest, his appearance was a real homecoming, and the greeting affectionate in the extreme. At a charming reception given at the house of Albert's father after the concert, I met the historian Ferrero and a delightful acquaintance from previous visits, Mrs. Janet Ross. She is a daughter of the beautiful Lady Duff Gordon, and when she was a child, George Meredith had occupied a cottage on her father's estate in England. He had adored her, and it was said that she had been his inspiration for Rose in Evan Harrington. I had met her in Florence in 1913, when she already was well over 70, and a woman of remarkable intellectual power and physical activity. She lives in a delightful old villa with walls 2 feet thick on a hill below Fiesole. Boccaccio had written part of his Decameron there, and the house was filled with interesting old Italian furniture. She made her own olive oil and vermouth on her farm, and sold large quantities of it to England. When I admired some exquisite dining-room chairs, she told me she had found them in Pisa, and that they were good 18th century models. She said, "I have a little Italian carpenter who carves wood very well, and if you like, I can have these copied for you, and they will cost you very little. I have these chairs in my house today, and value them doubly as having come to me through the good offices of this interesting lady." She had also made a remarkable collection of old Italian stornelli, which she had heard through mingling with the Italian peasants and farmers in Tuscany and elsewhere, and had noted down. As this collection numbers literally hundreds of folk songs, many of them dating back centuries, it should prove valuable to the connoisseur. End of section 22. Section 23 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 16, The European Tour, Part 3. In Parma the following day, I visited the Teatro Farnese. It is the oldest theater in Italy, and while it is in a somewhat dilapidated condition and, of course, no longer used for performances, it is fascinating as a relic, and one can well imagine what splendid pageants and dramatic cantatas must have been performed there before the great nobles of that day and their retinue. The Teatro Regio seemed to me the most beautiful that we had played in. It seated over 2,000 people, and we marveled that so small a town as Parma should be the proud possessor of such a home for music. The heat was again intense, but as the audience were in an extremely receptive and tumultuous mood, we did not mind it, and the orchestra played superbly. I was sorry, therefore, to have been compelled to nip in the bud a little plot which I luckily discovered that evening. 16 adventurous young members of the orchestra had very quietly decided that they would take a midnight train for Venice, spend a happy day there on its lagoons, with perhaps even a swim on the Lido, and then take another night train for Milan, arriving just in time for our concert there. Milan is an important musical center, and I did not wish to play there with an orchestra partly tired out by 2-night trips, besides the strong possibility of delayed Italian trains, which operate on the principle of chi va piano, va sano, ma non lontano. I therefore had to forbid this little excursion, although I sympathized strongly with our men for wanting to carry it out. I arrived in Milan 2 hours ahead of the orchestra, and was met at the station by a committee consisting of Signor Finci, the president of the Milan Symphony Society, under whose auspices we were to play, Campanari, brother of my old friend the baritone, and honorary secretary of the Verdi Home for Aged Musicians, the prefect of the police, and several others. All had pale and anxious faces, and had come to tell me that there was not a room to be had in Milan, that several hotels had closed their doors, as there was a restaurant and waiters' strike, and that they wanted to consult with me what had better be done. That mischievous strike devil evidently was to be a permanent member of our organization on the entire tour. I retired with the committee to the room of the prefect at the railroad station and discussed various plans, although in the back of my mind was the firm conviction that my men would find rooms, beds, and food if they were suddenly dumped in the middle of the desert of Sahara. I finally asked Campanari if there were any spare rooms in the Verdi Home for Aged Musicians, and he informed me that the entire home was empty, as they had not been able to operate it at all during the war, owing to lack of funds. There were plenty of beds, blankets, and sheets, but no servants of any kind. This was at least something, and I thought that my young men would not at all mind sleeping in beds that were intended for aged musicians and doing their own chamber work. The prefect also suggested several empty beds in the city hospital, but this did not look to me so inviting. However, I finally arranged with them to meet again at the station on the arrival of the orchestra, and I would put the matter before them, and then let them go forth and fare for themselves. Anyone who had not found a bed should return to the station and report at the office of the prefect, who would then see that some kind of accommodation was found. This plan was carried out, and my manager reported to me that at the final hour only 2 of our orchestra reported at the station, the one to say that he had found no room, and the other that he had 2. These two men went off arm in arm, therefore, and my faith in the orchestra was again abundantly justified, although the hotel strike here was even worse than in Genoa. I was quartered with my family at the Continental Hotel, and, with the exception of a few toothless old hags who made a pretense of taking care of the rooms, there was no service of any kind. The principal cause of the strike seems to have been a realization on the part of hotel employees that it was undignified for them to accept tips, especially as the tipping system produced such unequal results, the chambermaid on the first floor of a hotel receiving often 10 times as much in tips as the one who officiated on the 4th floor. They therefore demanded that a tax of 10 to 15% be added to the bills of travelers, this amount then to be distributed among the employees according to a certain schedule. In the meantime, we sizzled in the heat and suffered. To add to our discomfort, there was a great scarcity in the city's supply of water, and if one wanted a bath, it could only be obtained at 6 o'clock in the morning or after 10 at night. But again, the discipline of the men and the determination to demonstrate themselves as an artistic organization manifested itself in a remarkable way, and both of our concerts were superbly played and enthusiastically received. We considered Milan one of the most important cities of our tour. Its opera at the famous La Scala is world-renowned, and of recent years, especially through the efforts of Maestro Toscanini, a highly cultivated audience for symphonic music has developed. Toscanini, whom I had known and often admired in America, was rehearsing and conducting in Padua. To my surprise and delight, he took a night train from there in order to be present at our Sunday afternoon concert and to give me a brotherly greeting. After the concert, he accompanied me to the railroad station, where he was to take the night train back to Padua. As we arrived, my orchestra, who were already in their respective sleeping cars, recognized him, and, with a great roar of welcome, gave him 3 American cheers. Our 3 days in Milan had been very busy ones. On Friday afternoon, the Recording Music Publishing Company gave us a reception, showing the orchestra through their enormous printing works. The first concert was given that evening. On Saturday, the mayor and commune of Milan gave us a reception with a visit to the city museum at the Castello Sforzesco. This was followed by a concert given for us by the excellent municipal band in the courtyard, and a tea which consisted of all manner of sandwiches, ices, cakes, and above all, innumerable bottles of champagne. We were all glad that there was no concert that evening. After the Sunday concert, a number of motor buses took the orchestra and musical instruments quickly to the station, while our Italian friends stood around and marveled at what they called American efficiency, and we rolled out of Milan and Italy on our way to Strasbourg. Exceedingly tired, but with a feeling that we had brought Italy and America many steps nearer to each other by our visit. We had been simply overwhelmed with demonstrations of affection from the moment we arrived in Italy, and there is something in the almost childlike manner in which the Italians demonstrate their feelings that endeared them very quickly to us. They are seething with vitality, and the very intensity of their emotions, which to the cooler North American temperament sometimes seems exaggerated, is a force to be reckoned with in the future of the world. While their civilization is the oldest in Europe, they seem to be the youngest people of today, and in my profession and the kindred arts, I expect great things from the Italian people as soon as the dreadful aftermath of the World War should have been cleared away. I was much interested in Strasbourg and Metz, in the curious mixture of German and French civilization. In Strasbourg, we were very cordially received by the new director of the conservatory, Monsieur Ropartz of Nancy, one of France's most distinguished musicians. At Metz, the mayor made a speech of welcome, and with a group of citizens gave us a vin d'honneur after the concert. Both cities gave us audiences evidently accustomed to concerts of symphonic music, and with a fine appreciation of what we would offer them. On the public square in Strasbourg, I noticed a group of citizens excitedly pointing toward a steeple on the opposite side, and, lo and behold, I saw a stork, the first one to get back from his winter sojourn in Africa to spend the summer in his native haunts. The reader will wonder that I have not something more exciting to relate, but I confess that the complete freedom from the official and social engagements after our hectic weeks in Italy came like a heavenly balm, not to mention the agreeable change of living again in a hotel with real waiters, chambermaids, and cooks to minister to one's comfort. I looked at that stork, and suddenly an old doggerel jumped into my head that I had sung with other children over 50 years before, and which begins, Storch, Storch, Steiner, mit die langen Beiner. And here was perhaps a descendant of the very bird whom we had greeted so long ago. I was inclined to become sentimental over this interesting possibility, but the stork flew away without showing any reciprocal interest, and my mood did not last long. We returned to Paris the following day, and on the morning of June 4th started in a special train to Fontainebleau, where the entire orchestra were to be guests of the mayor and municipality for the day. The suggestions which I had made to Francis Casadessus in Paris and Chaumont during our long talks in 1918, while he and I were examining the 200 bandmasters of the AEF, had borne quick fruits. Casadessus had communicated my suggestion of a summer school for American musicians to his very musical friend, Monsieur Fragnol, the sous-prefet of Fontainebleau. He in turn had interested Monsieur Bonnet, the mayor, and in consequence a quick decision had been reached that the summer school should be placed at Fontainebleau and housed in an entire wing of the historic Palais de Fontainebleau, which would be donated for this purpose by the French government. I was delighted at this happy outcome, and, as the people concerned evidently wished to signalize it by some special fete, I gladly accepted their invitation to give a concert there with our orchestra, and make this, so to speak, the beginning of relations which will, I hope, help materially to bring France and America musically closer together for many years to come. Many French musicians and dignitaries were on the train to take part in the day's celebration. There were Monsieur Paul Léon, representing the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, Alfred Cortot, distinguished pianist, Mangio, editor of the Monde Musicale and founder of the École Normale de Musique in Paris, Francis and Henri Casadessus, Mademoiselle Boulanger, Albert Bruneau, composer of the opera Le Rêve, Monsieur Dumesnil, deputy for Fontainebleau, and many others. The whole town had been declared en fête. Every shop was closed, and French and American flags, gaily intertwined, festooned all the principal streets. The street leading to the mairie was lined on both sides by French troops, and we all tried to look as if we were delegates to the Versailles Conference as we marched to the reception of the mayor and looked at this martial array. The luncheon which followed was one of those typical French affairs in which the gay was charmingly mingled with the more serious and ceremonial. Monsieur Dumesnil proved himself one of the greatest orators I have ever heard, and played upon every emotion of the human heart, evoking tears and laughter with the voice and diction of a virtuoso. He was succeeded by Monsieur Bruneau, arising and suddenly addressing me, and at the close pinning the Legion d'Honneur on my coat, after which, to the huge delight of my orchestra, he, in true French fashion, kissed me on both cheeks. It is very agreeable to have one's orchestra present while such honors are conferred, as their approval demonstrates itself in most noisy fashion, and my boys know that this particular decoration is as much theirs as mine. As there was no theatre in Fontainebleau large enough to hold the huge audience, the concert was given in the Ménage d'Artillerie, which had been hastily converted into a concert hall. It proved excellent for this purpose, except that as soon as we began playing, hundreds of birds, which had had undisturbed possession of the rafters and of the musical privileges of this building for years, were evidently disturbed and angered by our intrusion. They suddenly flew out from their nests and burst into shrill songs of protest, which mingled, not without interesting results, with the harmonies of the New World Symphony, played by special request of the sous-prefet, Monsieur Fragnol, who is himself an excellent amateur oboe player. In the front rows of the audience were hundreds of school children who had been dressed en American, with enormous bows and sashes composed of the American stars and stripes. That there were several hundred of these I can testify, as I had to shake hands with every one of them after the concert. The following day, before leaving for Belgium, I received the welcome news that a rather disagreeable matter concerning our 3 concerts at the Paris Opera had been most amicably settled. The opera house, which is the property of the French government, had been offered to us by the Ministère des Beaux-Arts free of rent, but we were to pay for the actual expenses of light, heat, and service incurred. When I first arrived in Paris, our local manager informed us that the director of the opera, who holds a lease of the building, intended to charge us 30,000 francs for his expenses. This seemed to me excessive, and I remonstrated with Mr. Léon, the director of the Beaux-Arts. The director of the opera, who had lost millions of francs at the opera during the war, was a man of wealth to whom the opera was more or less of a personal toy, but he evidently wished to recoup somewhat on us, for he argued that, inasmuch as he might have given opera performances on the days and hours when we had our concerts, we should be charged with the pro rata expense of his singers, orchestra, chorus, and ballet. This argument, however, did not seem valid to us, as, since time immemorial, there had never been any opera performances on those days of the week. I presented our case to M. Léon and told him that as I had never had any dealing or arrangement with the director of the opera, but only with the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, I was compelled to leave the matter entirely in their hands. We were their guests, and if they felt that we should pay 30,000 francs for expenses, we would most certainly do so. The results were most satisfactory, but not entirely unexpected by me, and the sum which we finally paid was a perfectly fair amount. We went to Brussels on June 3rd by motor, through a great part of the devastated regions, and all the horror and misery of destroyed villages, field after field pockmarked by shell explosions, and dreary remains of a few stumps of trees where had been acres and acres of forest. On our arrival, we were welcomed with open arms by our ambassador, Brand Whitlock, and his wife. He told me that but 2 weeks before he had been suddenly informed that we could not play at the Théâtre Royal de la Monnaie because the Socialist Organization of Brussels claimed the right to it for an entertainment of their own. There had been a mix-up because the director of the opera, who had promised us the theater, had died, and the new incumbent claimed to have no knowledge of our coming. They intended to place us in a Flemish theater, which of course did not have the dignity of the Royal Opera House, and Mr. Whitlock promptly told them that, as we were there by invitation of the Belgian government, and as our coming had an international significance, he could not permit us to be ordered out of our rightful possession of the Théâtre de la Monnaie, and if we could not have that, he would telegraph to me urging us to cancel the concert. This evidently produced results. The Socialist Organization was appealed to, and immediately and courteously said that it would do anything for an American orchestra. The same lack of what we would call proper management of concerts seemed to exist in Brussels as in many cities of France and Italy. Large advertisements, such as fill the amusement columns of American papers, are hardly ever used. 2 lines inserted only once or twice are the rule. Reading notices giving the program or other information regarding the concert are printed only if paid for at so much a line. Small posters, which are pasted on street corners for a week or 2, are almost the only advertising indulged in. Transfer companies, such as in our country, meet a musical or theatrical organization at the station with a specified number of trucks to carry the musical baggage or scenery to the theater, are not known. We had put this important part of our tour into the hands of Thomas Cook and Sons and their representative. On the arrival of the train, would negotiate with this or that driver lounging around the station and lazily looking for jobs. In Italy, the porters again and again simply refused to transport our stuff because the weather was too hot, and they would only begin at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, when 30 little handcarts, pushed by as many men, would carry the musical instruments to the theater. Luckily, concerts in Italy begin at 9 or 9:30, so we always managed in one way or another to get our instruments transported. Several times, however, even soldiers in military camions were bribed into service. This slovenliness, which is maddening to an American, is so universal in Europe, especially since the war, that one marvels how anything can be accomplished, and yet, with the exception of places where strikes interfered, we got along, even though we were sometimes wild with anxiety and foolishly furious at what we considered to be their national characteristics. Everybody in Belgium, however, seems to read the posters, for the demand for seats in Brussels was so great that we could have filled the little opera house twice over. Its acoustics are marvelous, and the strings vibrate like an old Cremona violin. They had specially requested that the concert should be purely symphonic and without any soloist. I therefore gave them the lovely Mozart Jupiter Symphony and the César Franck D minor. Franck had been born in Liège, and I wished to demonstrate to them our love and understanding of this noble musician. I do not think I have ever played before an audience more sensitive to the beauties of music. As a special compliment to Brussels, we played an adagio for strings by Lequeux, a modern, highly talented young Belgian composer who unfortunately had died at the age of 24. The adagio is a work of tender, melancholy beauty, and sounded so exquisite in this building that the players and I were intensely moved by it during the performance. This emotion was evidently communicated to the audience, so that at the close their applause could not be quieted, and I finally had to take the score of the composition from my desk and point to it in silent pantomime. After the concert, as I was preparing to leave the theater, 2 ladies came toward me with an old man who proved to be the father of Guillaume Lequeux. He tried to thank me for our playing of his son's composition, but broke down completely as the tears poured down his face. The following day at Antwerp, I saw again to my great delight the famous old tenor Van Dyck, with whom I had given many a Wagner opera during our engagement at the Metropolitan with the Maurice Grau Opera Company. His villa near Antwerp had been occupied by a German general and his staff during the 4 years of the war. They had drunk up his entire wine cellar, consisting of many hundred bottles of choice vintages, and had also removed every bit of copper from his doorknobs and kitchen. Otherwise, they had left his house intact, and, with imperturbable good humor and courage, Van Dyck had taken up again the work of gaining an existence for his family. Twice a week he went to Brussels, where he had an interesting class in dramatic singing at the Royal Conservatory, and besides this he was busily engaged as a director of an insurance company. In Antwerp, as well as in Liège and Ghent, we found the same discriminating and educated audiences as in Brussels. Hardly anywhere did we see the ravages of war, and what little there were being quickly repaired by the industrious inhabitants. We left Belgium on June 10th to enter Holland, playing at The Hague that evening and in Amsterdam the day after. In Holland, our American diplomatic representative, William Phillips, minister to The Hague, had been active in ensuring us a welcome. He was an old friend and had invited not only the Queen Mother, who is the only musical member of the royal household, but a distinguished party of nearly 100, including all the diplomatic representatives and the highest officials of the court and governments, to be his guests at the concert. After the first part, he introduced me to the Queen Mother, who proved to be very charming and much interested in music, and who also possessed that delightful royal quality of putting you at your ease. This consists in asking a question and then not waiting for you to answer, but answering it in all its possibilities and bearings herself. Conversation is thus made rather one-sided, but agreeable, even though all the brilliant things one might have said remain unuttered. After the concert, the entire distinguished party assembled at the legation for a delicious supper, at which I met a great many charming Dutch ladies who, fortunately for me, spoke English or French. The next day, Mr. Phillips motored me to Amsterdam. There, the members of the local orchestra immediately poured into the willing ears of my men dreadful stories of local jealousy of our coming, that several of the newspapers had been told to criticize us severely, and that all the adherents of the local orchestra had ostentatiously decided to absent themselves from our concert. Very little of this proved to be true. The huge hall in which we played, the Concertgebouw, has a stage perched up so high that the people in the parquet literally have to strain their necks to see the performers, and the reverberation of sound is excessive. The hall seats 3,000 people, and there were not more than 1,400 at our concert. However, they certainly made up in enthusiasm what they lacked in numbers. All previous notions of the phlegm of the Dutch people were completely dissipated. Not being a prima donna, I did not keep count of the many times I was recalled after the Eroica Symphony, but as I had to march down and up a platform of about 50 steps each time, the exercise in connection with it was considerable. The newspapers next morning, in spite of all the dark rumors, were enthusiastic in our praise and generous in their comparison of our orchestra with their own splendid organization. London marked the last lap of our musical race through Europe. We stayed a week and gave 5 concerts, 4 at Queen's Hall on June 14th, 15th, 16th, and 19th, and 1 on June 20th at the huge Royal Albert Hall. The lucky star which had accompanied us during the entire tour shone for us with steadfast light during this last week. The orchestra never played better, and the newspapers heartily echoed the reception we received from the public. I had not conducted in London since a concert mentioned elsewhere in these reminiscences, given at Prince's Hall by Ovid Mussen in 1888, when I was but 26 years of age. Since then, great changes have come over the musical life of England. At that time, music was to a great extent in the hands of foreigners, and one has only to see the old pictures by Du Maurier and Punch to realize that the musician in English drawing rooms was generally a long-haired German or Italian. Hans Richter was the great popular conductor in London, and there were many foreigners in the British orchestras. Since then, the Anglicization of music had been going on rapidly, thanks principally to great music schools, such as the Royal College of Music, under Sir Charles Villiers Stanford and Sir Hugh Allen, and the Royal Academy of Music, under Sir Alexander Mackenzie. These schools educate great numbers of orchestral musicians, and today the personnel of British orchestras is composed almost entirely of native-born. Many of us consider Sir Edward Elgar the greatest symphonic composer since Brahms, and his education has been altogether British. A group of English conductors, of whom Sir Henry Wood is the dean, and Albert Coates and Eugene Goossens among the most gifted, have made for themselves an international reputation. England has now the material for a strong national musical life. With such conductors as she possesses, and her splendid orchestral material, her orchestras would soon rival those of America if her citizens would give them the same generous support which our organizations receive. But in this respect, the condition of London is very much what it was in New York, preceding and during the first half of my career. Her orchestras are to a great extent cooperative. The concerts are projected and given by the members of the orchestra, and they divide the profits among themselves. These profits are exceedingly small and do not really pay them for the time given to the rehearsals and concerts. The London Symphony, for instance, gives only 8 concerts during the winter and rarely has more than 3 rehearsals to a concert. In consequence of this, while the players have developed a great facility in reading at sight and making the most of the limited rehearsal time, the results cannot be as finely worked out as is possible in the generously endowed orchestras of America, which assemble their players every morning for rehearsal and give more than 100 symphonic concerts during a winter. We lay great stress on unanimity of bowing, for proper phrasing can only be secured if the 16 first violins, for instance, who have to play a phrase in unison, play as one. To the educated ear, there is a great difference in the effect if 1 or 2 or more notes are played on the same bow, or if a phrase is begun with an up or a down bow. Generally speaking, this unanimity in our playing impressed and delighted our London audiences and critics, but one of the latter was evidently annoyed by it as he began his analysis of our concert with the headline, "Orchestra Too Perfect to Be Good." His eye had evidently been accustomed to the more free and easy bowing at some of their own concerts, and he thought that a more emotionally inspired effect was produced if the individual member of the orchestra is not restricted by too much discipline. It must be acknowledged, however, that a good conductor must guard himself from the temptation to make a god out of technique, which should, after all, be merely a means to an end. Because of our undoubted superiority in orchestras and opera, we cannot, however, claim to be a more musical people than the British. Their love and cultivation of choral music is far greater than ours, and they have a small group of composers whose work is more important and interesting than the aggregate we can as yet produce. Augustus Littleton and his friends arranged many affairs for our pleasure, among them a ceremonial luncheon at the Mansion House by the Lord Mayor of London. This luncheon was attended also by the American ambassador, Mr. Davis, Viscount Bryce, and many of the foremost English musicians. My orchestra was hugely delighted and impressed with the quaint medieval ceremonies, the gorgeous uniforms and liveries, and the prodigal hospitality displayed by our kind host. As a mark of special friendliness toward the New York Symphony Orchestra and its first visit to Great Britain, I was made a member of the Worshipful Company of Musicians, founded by James I in 1604, and was presented with the silver medal of that ancient organization. Our ambassador proved himself just as able to discourse eloquently on the importance of music as on any other theme which might tend to strengthen cultural bonds between the two nations. Both he and his wife had evidently endeared themselves to the English people, and many were the regrets when, with the change of party in Washington, he tendered his resignation. Throughout the luncheon, Lord Bryce beamed his approval of the proceedings, as he had given nearly all of his energies during the later years of his life toward a better understanding between the two English-speaking countries. The orchestra sailed for America on the Olympic on the Tuesday following our last concert, and I bade them good-bye with my heart in my mouth. They had done such honor to our president, Mr. Flagler, to our country, and to their conductor. During the entire tour of 7 weeks, there had not been one lapse from perfect discipline, a discipline largely self-imposed. Each one had felt his responsibility and had acted accordingly. Their plane had been at high-water mark continually, and they had borne the inevitable fatigues and annoyances of constant travel with unfailing good humor. On the other hand, their delights had been many. They had seen the great art treasures and scenic beauties of 5 countries, and with that quick perception which is one of the characteristics of American life, they had taken full advantage of their opportunities. If they gave of their best with both hands, Europe certainly returned with equal prodigality, and there is not one of my men who would not jump at the chance to repeat our experiences at the first opportunity, naturally still further extending the tour to include Germany, Austria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. We are still somewhat shy of Russia, however, as the reports which my Russian musicians get from their former country are too dismal and uninviting. End of section 23. Section 24 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 17, Women in Musical Affairs. In Europe, music sprang from the ground, and it is the folk songs and folk dances of the peasant that have gradually refined and developed in the hands of the great composers, worked their way upward, and become the possession and delight of the cultured classes. In this country we have no peasantry, and what slight remains of folk songs and folk dances we possess, apart from the music of the Negro, have only recently been dug out of the isolated mountain fastnesses of Kentucky and Tennessee. These are generally of British origin and cannot be considered as having been part and parcel of our national life. As against the rich subsoil of the folk songs of Germany, Bohemia, Russia, France, and Scotland, we can show but the thinnest artificial layer of music, and this has been created and carefully nurtured by a small, educated class. The dreary social life of the early Puritan settlers and their frowning attitude toward the joys of life further retarded the growth of the arts among us. I do not think there has ever been a country whose musical development has been fostered so almost exclusively by women as America. Musical education began among the well-to-do classes who could afford to engage the European musicians who immigrated to America to teach their daughters, but not, alas, their sons. A strong feeling existed that music was essentially an effeminate art, and that its cultivation by a man took away that much from his manliness and, above all, made him unfit to worship at the most sacred shrine of business. I am speaking now of 50 years ago. Conditions have improved since that time, but not sufficiently as yet to produce normal and healthy conditions regarding the civilization of our people. Women's musical clubs began to form in many a village, town, and city, and these clubs became the active and efficient nucleus of the entire musical life of the community, but alas, again, principally the feminine community. It is to these women's clubs that the managers turn for fat guarantees for appearances of their artists, and it is before audiences of whom 75% are women that these artists disport themselves. The result of this has been that the cultural life of American women has often been absolutely a thing apart from their relations with their menfolk. It has become accepted that, of course, men do not and need not share the women's interest in the arts, and while business does not perhaps monopolize the American man in quite as unhealthy a fashion as in former years, the principal change which has been brought about is the introduction of golf, at least an occupation in which men and women may share. What a pity that the elusive ball is not composed of a little Beethoven and Brahms instead of the mysterious mixture of concrete and gutta percha, and that family life, which is the very fortress of civilization, cannot make use of the cultivation of music as one of the strongest ties to bind husband and wife, sons and daughters together. Some of us are too prone to look upon modern plumbing, telephones, and motor cars as evidences of high civilization or even culture, when they are really only more or less agreeable conveniences which minister to our comfort but not to our heart or head. In Europe, men and women share more equally in the love and cultivation of music, and the emotional and personal attitude of the women is offset by the more impersonal and mental attitude of the men. The result of this is shown in audiences in which neither sex predominates, and above all, in the cultivation of chamber music at home, in which professionals and amateurs, men and women, participate to their mutual pleasure and development. Nothing more charming can be imagined than such family evenings of music, during which the players indulge themselves in the string quartets and piano trios of Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, with perhaps a small audience of enthusiasts composed of other members of the family and half a dozen friends, who afterward all join in a jolly supper of bread and cold meats, together with a good bottle of wine or beer. My father carried this lovely custom into the New World, and I owe almost my entire education in chamber music to the Sunday afternoons at his house, the tranquil and spiritual atmosphere of which is unforgettable. A few years ago, a meeting was held in the mayor's office at City Hall, at which I had been asked to speak in behalf of good music for the people on Sunday afternoons and evenings. A clergyman from Brooklyn had made a tremendous appeal against any Sunday recreations and wanted the aldermen to revive the old blue laws of 200 years ago. The room was crowded with people, and when I spoke of what the chamber music on Sunday afternoons at my father's house had meant to me as a boy, this audience broke into such enthusiastic applause that there was no mistaking the general attitude, and my Sunday symphony concerts, which I was the first to inaugurate in New York, have only once been interfered with by municipal authorities. Some American women have realized the false and one-sided condition of musical culture in our country and have sought to remedy it by encouraging their sons to take up the study of some musical instrument, but it has been uphill work, as the general sentiment of the country has not yet been sufficiently awakened. Plato considered the study and appreciation of music an educational necessity for the young Athenian, but such schools as Groton, St. Paul's, and St. Mark's, for instance, have not yet admitted music to their regular curriculum, and insofar as it is studied there, it is considered rather an outside privilege with which the school course has no official connection. Among the boys, the necessity for excelling in football or baseball is so carefully and consistently insisted upon that almost the entire time left from school hours is devoted to these sports, and the boy who wants to continue the study of a musical instrument, which a fond mother has perhaps begun with him before he entered the school, is looked upon by the other boys as a sissy. The standard of personal conduct set in these schools is high, but the tendency seems to be to make the boys as like each other as possible. Many of them, if not discouraged, would develop decided artistic talent, but individuality and independence of thinking, which should be the end and aim of all teaching, is often frowned upon, and the results only contribute still further to the monotony of our social life, in which the courage to be oneself is submerged in the desire to be exactly like everyone else. The public schools of our country, however, show a much more intelligent attitude than formerly, and while the time allowed for singing and the study of the beginnings of music is still all too short, music is taught to the boys as well as to the girls. The singing of the children has greatly improved, and in many cities school orchestras have been formed, which the boys and girls enjoy immensely, and in many of which music of good character is studied. In Los Angeles and Berkeley, California, I heard some excellent school orchestras, and in Dayton, Ohio, Mrs. Talbot has interested herself personally in this movement with great enthusiasm and excellent results. In New York, my brother Frank, while supervisor of music in the public schools, effected a complete reform in the teaching of the children and succeeded in interesting the authorities to give music a more important position. The singing improved immensely, and since his retirement, Mr. Gartland, his successor, has continued the good work. I have several times used choruses of 1,000 school children at the music festivals of the Oratorio Society in the production of such works as Pierne's exquisite The Crusade of the Children and The Children of Bethlehem, and the children sang the three-part harmonies of their music with such purity and exquisite quality of tone as to bring happy tears to the eyes of the audience. School orchestras have been formed all over the city, and once a year I take my entire orchestra to one of the large auditoriums of the public high schools, and for 2,000 little would-be orchestra musicians, we play a program composed of the music they have been studying during the winter. We never play before a more enthusiastic and delightful audience. 31 years ago, I gave the first orchestral concert for children, and 25 years ago, my brother Frank founded the Young People's Symphony Concerts, which were designed to introduce the beauties of orchestral music to children, and in a short explanatory talk to unravel its mysteries of construction and demonstrate the tone colors of the different instruments of the orchestra. These concerts have proved an enormous success and of great importance for the education of the coming generation. When my brother retired from public work in order to devote himself exclusively to the direction of the Institute of Musical Art, I took over these concerts and have since added another course intended exclusively for little children from 7 to 12 years of age. The audiences are truly remarkable. The faces of the children are aglow with interest and excitement, and when I sit down at the piano after playing an overture with the orchestra and, repeating some melodic phrase from it, ask them which instrument played this melody, their little voices ring out from all over the hall in high, shrill accents like little pistol shots. The oboe, the trumpet. Then I let all those who think it was the oboe raise their hands, and if they are right, great is their triumph, and if they are wrong, equally great is their chagrin. Generally, they are right. On my orchestral tours, I have several times given such children's concerts on the afternoon preceding the regular evening symphony, and while 2 such concerts in one day are a great exertion, the children's especially demanding a great output of vitality in order to keep their interest, I have felt more than repaid by the results. In many of the cities, my work in this direction has been continued by the local orchestras or musical clubs, again the women, and with the happiest results. In New York, also women devoted to music have greatly contributed toward its development, but occasionally the result of their efforts has not been so beneficial. Not so long ago, a handsome but incompetent foreign musician, I will not disclose any name or dates in this story, came to New York and enlisted the sympathies of a few enthusiastic women. As many women need some personality on which to center their devotion to art, they decided that New York should have this particular gentleman to direct its symphonic future. The American businessman is proverbially good-natured to his womenkind and ready to pour out money for music, provided he is not compelled to listen to it, and so these ladies gathered a huge fund with which to give a series of orchestral concerts. The amount was large enough to maintain a good symphony orchestra in proper hands for an entire winter, but in this instance was to be expended on 6 concerts only. The handsome young foreigner gave his first concert, which was a failure so complete and dismal, he being not only without any reputation, but with hardly any experience in work of this kind, that even his little group of adorers became appalled and proposed to cancel the rest of the concerts. One lady, however, who had her own special favorite conductor, suggested that a complete disgrace might be averted if her protégé were invited to conduct the remaining concerts. As he was an excellent artist and thoroughly routine in the handling of orchestral players, the results were so good, and, above all, such a contrast to the dire tragedy of the first concert, that the enthusiastic lady devotee saw her opportunity and suggested that a new orchestra should be formed for the following winter, the concerts of which should be conducted by the man who had saved the situation for them. New York had already an average during the winter of 150 symphonic concerts by the New York Philharmonic, the New York Symphony, the Boston Symphony, and the Philadelphia Orchestra, and it would seem from this that the symphonic needs of our public were already more than amply supplied. But an enthusiastic woman, especially when driven by devotion for some pet artist, refuses to recognize practical conditions, and so this little group proceeded to gather more funds, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars, in order to put the new orchestra properly on its feet. Their first difficulty was to find good players. There are never very many first-class symphonic players to be found. Not only do the 2 old-established New York orchestras employ about 100 players each, but the orchestras of other cities come to New York to fill their vacancies. For years, the Philharmonic, the New York Symphony, and other out-of-town orchestras had a gentleman's agreement that they would not steal each other's players, but this new organization immediately proceeded to take 37 from the Philharmonic by offering them immensely higher salaries. They did not take a single player from the New York Symphony Orchestra because, as they vowed, of their great personal respect for me, but I think it was partly because we happened to have a 2-year contract with all our men, which bound them to us very effectively for another season. They filled their ranks further from members of the Boston Orchestra and from other out-of-town organizations, and then proceeded on their first regular season as a New York orchestra, with loud protestations that New York at last had an organization worthy of the metropolis. This orchestra carried on its existence for 2 years, at the end of which it came to a dismal close, with an expenditure for the 3 seasons over and above the receipts of the box office of nearly $1 million, which their surprised and chagrined men guarantors had to pay. This is but one of several such irregular ventures, each one of which has swallowed hundreds of thousands. One would think that the inevitable failure of these efforts would deter others from undertaking them, but such is not the case. Hope springs eternal in the breast of the musical woman devotee, and I have just heard of a new orchestra now being formed in order to enable still another foreigner, whose interpretations will of course be a revelation to our public, to wield his stick in this country as his own has refused to accept him at his own valuation. In recent years, chamber music in New York has received great encouragement and intelligent support from women. Mrs. Frederick S. Coolidge has proved a veritable godmother to this lovely branch of musical art, and every fall the festivals of chamber music, which she gives in Pittsfield in the Berkshire Hills, bring together notable gatherings of musicians and music lovers as her guests. For several years, she has offered generous prizes in competition for various forms of chamber music, but to me the most encouraging thing that she has done is the commissioning of certain composers to write compositions for these festivals. Neither string quartets nor violin sonatas can ever become profitable to the composer in the ordinary way of commerce, as the number of copies which can be sold of such works is necessarily limited. Even young American composers must live, and if they are to devote their time to the creation of serious forms of art, they should be assured of at least some financial recompense for the time they must give to it. Mrs. Ralph Pulitzer has entirely maintained an excellent string quartet for the past 3 years, and I should like to see such excellent examples followed by others among our well-to-do, as chamber music is essentially written for performance in the home, and loses much of its charm and intimacy if given in a larger hall and before hundreds of people. For some time to come, the initiative for a more general musical education of our people will have to come from the women. If American mothers will demand and obtain for their sons the same musical privileges and opportunities which their daughters now enjoy, America will speedily become the most musical country in the world. So much has already been done, but much remains, and I should like to live 100 years longer just to watch this development and to rejoice in its results. End of section 24. Section 25 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 18, Boston. In 1887, I visited Boston for the first time professionally. I had begun my Wagnerian lecture recitals in New York a year or two before, and they had spread like wildfire in all directions. The enthusiasm for Wagner, which had been kindled into a bright flame by my father's founding of German opera at the Metropolitan Opera House, had produced a widespread desire for better acquaintance with Wagner's music and his theories regarding the music drama. I received an invitation from a group of Boston women, including Mrs. John L. Gardner, Mrs. O.B. Frothingham, Mrs. George Tyson, and Mrs. Henry Whitman, to give my lecture recitals on the Nibelungen trilogy. Boston at that time occupied a unique position as the only city in America which possessed a permanent orchestra, maintained by Major Henry Lee Higginson, for the cultivation of symphonic music. A small group of highly educated and socially prominent Bostonians, belonging to the oldest New England families, made this orchestra almost the focus of their social life. The weekly concerts were the great events, the programs eagerly discussed, and its conductor Wilhelm Gericke was alternately cursed or blessed according to their attitude toward some novelty which he had just produced. Among this group I was made heartily welcome. The atmosphere was intensely local, if not provincial, and as against the searching, feverish life of a great metropolis like New York, with its many conflicting interests and racial currents, the tranquility and purely American quality of Boston life, as it presented itself to me, was a complete contrast. I am speaking of Boston of 35 years ago, and of conditions that have to a certain extent disappeared, for today even the young descendants of the New Englanders of that era seem to find their pleasures in different and more restless fashion. In the group of which I have spoken, Mrs. Gardner was among the most original and fascinating. She was certainly the leaven in the Boston lump, and sometimes shocked the more staid element by her innovations and interest in more modern currents in art and literature than had hitherto rippled its calm Emersonian surface. Boston was at that time perhaps the best example of that typically American musical culture of which I have spoken elsewhere, which instead of growing upward from the masses, was carefully introduced and nurtured by an aristocratic and cultivated community through symphony concerts and lectures on music. Its original impulse sprang perhaps more from the head than the heart, but it would not be fair, therefore, to say that New Englanders approach music only from the intellectual standpoint. I have seen very emotional outbursts among Boston audiences, both at my Wagner recitals and years after when I returned with the Damrosch Opera Company to give the Wagner music dramas. While it is possible that they felt heartily ashamed of these enthusiasms afterwards and exclaimed, "Is this Boston?" the fact remains that even a Bostonian is human, like other Americans, and needs only to be encouraged to prove that he too has a heart which can beat warmly and respond to the emotions kindled by art. Their capacity for friendship in the finest sense of the word is wonderful, and I achieved many of my dearest friends at that time. We have all grown much older since then, with the exception of Mrs. Gardner, on whom the years leave no imprint and whose enthusiasms for life and art flame just as brightly today as then. I was certainly very young in those days, and remember, after one of my lectures, which had gone off with great enthusiasm, walking along Boylston Street toward my hotel, thinking in my young conceit that I was evidently a good deal of a personage, when I saw that the street was filled with crowds of people, and the police were making a passage with difficulty so as to allow an open carriage, drawn by 2 horses, to pass through. In it sat a rather stout, smooth-shaven gentleman with a very shiny high silk hat, and the people were cheering him like mad. "Who is this?" I asked a bystander. He gave me a contemptuous look and stopped cheering just long enough to say, "Don't you know John L. Sullivan when you see him?" I accepted the rebuke meekly and entered my hotel a much more modest man than I had left it a few hours before. John L. Sullivan, Boston's greatest citizen, had just come home from a fight in London, but I do not know to this day whether he had won or lost. The Boston Orchestra was at that time conducted by Wilhelm Gericke, who had brought it to a remarkable state of proficiency. I found him to be a very likable man, a thorough musician, and always gentle and friendly in his attitude. I used to envy him because, while I had to maintain my orchestra at that time by my own exertions, he had a great philanthropist behind him. His orchestra was engaged by the year, played under no other conductor, and assembled every morning at 9:30, like clockwork, for rehearsal. Gericke brought the orchestra up to a high standard of virtuosity. His sense of values was absolute, and under his training, and greatly assisted by Franz Gneisel, his concertmaster, the strings soon acquired great unanimity and a ravishing quality of tone. His readings were always musicianly, although I felt occasionally that they were too reserved. He had a horror of the exaggeration of the brass instruments, and perhaps erred on the other side in subduing them too much. But when he returned, years after, for another 5 years in Boston, his readings had gained in freedom and elasticity, and the balance of the different choirs seemed perfectly adjusted. Boston, and indeed the country, owes him much. He was fortunate in his opportunities, but he proved himself worthy of them. Rightly or wrongly, Major Higginson had made it his rule to engage none but German conductors for his orchestra. He had gained his first enthusiasm for symphonic music as a young man in Vienna, and had got the idea firmly in his mind that only Germany could give his orchestra the leaders which it required. Among the long line of conductors who came and went, not all, naturally, were of equal worth. A few were distinctly second-raters, and I remember one whose blustering incompetence and conceit finally so enraged Major Higginson that, as the gentleman would not resign when requested, because his contract still had another year to run, Higginson sent him a check for the entire amount and dismissed him. Curiously enough, the impetus which the reputation of having been conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra gave was so great that it landed him in 2 other American orchestras, one of which he brought to the very verge of ruin, and the other he ruined altogether, so that the city which had founded it and lavished hundreds of thousands upon it is now without any symphony orchestra, and seems to have lost the courage to begin again. But among the conductors of the Boston Orchestra, 2 stand out as among the best that Europe has sent over. These are Arthur Nikisch and Dr. Karl Muck. The one died last winter, beloved and mourned by the musical public of all Europe and of North and South America. The other was sent from our country back to Germany after the war in deserved disgrace, after having been interned as prisoner of war at Fort Oglethorpe. When I first met Arthur Nikisch in 1887, he was conductor at the Leipzig Opera House. I had gone there to attend an annual meeting and festival of the Tonkünstlerverein, an association of which Franz Liszt had had always been the president, and which had originally been formed by a small group of Liszt Wagner Berlioz adherents, of whom my father was one. One of the features of the festival was a stage performance of Berlioz's Benvenuto Cellini, given in honor of Liszt. The work fascinated me, and his performance under the young Nikisch delighted me beyond words. In appearance he already had the same characteristics which his enemies decried, but which among his friends only aroused a delighted chuckle when he appeared on the platform, and which quickly changed to a hurricane of enthusiasm after he had demonstrated his marvelous skill as an interpreter. I refer to the long black lock, which always hung low over his forehead, and his still longer white cuffs, which more and more enveloped his little white hands as the performance progressed. Gericke had developed the orchestra into a perfect instrument, and when Nikisch arrived he played upon it like a virtuoso. I have always maintained that Nikisch achieved still greater mastery during his years in America, because until then he had had no such orchestra at his disposal. The much vaunted Leipzig Gewandhaus and the Berlin Philharmonic, which he conducted, suffer from the troubles common to all cooperative organizations. Their members outstay their period of usefulness and retain permanent places in the orchestra after they should give way to younger and better men. The readings of Nikisch were distinctly personal and therefore, because they reflected his own nature, so ingratiating that I have often enjoyed certain of his interpretations, although I considered them wrong and contrary to the intentions of the composer. Nikisch made them convincing for the moment. Dr. Muck, who became conductor of the Boston Symphony some years later, was less personal in his readings. His principal work in Germany had been the conducting of opera, and occasionally a lack of routine in symphonic work showed itself in badly combined programs, but only in that one respect. As a conductor of the symphonies of Beethoven and Brahms, he was a master, and to me his interpretations of Brahms rank among the finest that I have heard. It was a tragedy that this man, who had gained not only the confidence and respect of his patron, Major Higginson, to a greater degree than any other of the Boston conductors, who was admired not only in Boston, but in every city which the orchestra visited, and to whom America had given unbounded acclaim, should at the crucial moment have proved himself a supercilious, arrogant Prussian of the worst Junker type, ungrateful toward the man to whom he owed his many successful years in America, and finally even an abject coward and renegade toward the country to which he owed national allegiance. The story in its entirety is too unpleasant to be told, but as after Muck's return to Germany he saw fit to indulge in the most violent diatribes against America and its treatment of him, it is justifiable to tell a little of the truth in these pages. In order to understand the story properly, it is necessary to recall the excitement which swept through the country when we finally entered the Great War. Wars arouse prejudice as well as patriotism, and suspicion as well as faith. One of the curious, almost pathological results of the psychosis of war is the spy mania, and this manifested itself in the years of 1917 and 18 to a remarkable extent in America as well as in Europe. One need only recall the many stories of concrete tennis courts which were discovered and vouched for by reputable people as having been built years before by German army officers who, disguised as rich American financiers, had constructed lavish country places along the Atlantic seaboard, all of which possessed these remarkable concrete tennis courts. These were to support great guns, which at the proper moment were to put the American Navy out of existence. There were also wonderful stories of secret wires discovered in private houses, and of strange beacon lights suddenly flaming up at regular intervals along the coast in order to signal messages to some mysterious German submarine. It was all like a war novel of Oppenheim, and as some of our ladies joined the Secret Service in an unofficial capacity, they, together with others who conceived it to be the height of faithlessness to our country to enjoy a symphony of Beethoven or an opera of Wagner while we were at war with Germany, had a beautiful time in the happy illusion that they were doing real war work. Dr. Muck immediately became a center of suspicion. He had taken a cottage at Seal Harbor, Maine, for the summer of 1917, and of course he was immediately accused of having a wireless outfit and signaling to a whole fleet of German submarines which were cruising off Mount Desert Island, and whose immediate object was, of course, to capture all the millionaires of Bar Harbor and hold them captives for huge ransoms. According to others, he had placed a telephone receiver in the cellar of his house in Boston, which skillfully tapped the wire of the telephone of the lady next door, and she, to her horror, had one morning on lifting her telephone in order to call up her butcher, heard his guttural German voice conversing with some mysterious German at the other end about a shipment of dynamite, which was to be used, of course, to destroy Faneuil Hall and the birthplace of Henry W. Longfellow in Maine. There was not a story so wild that it did not gain credence, but it was not so strange that many of these preposterous rumors should center around Dr. Muck. His attitude toward us had become more and more supercilious. That he should sympathize with his own country was perhaps natural, but that he should use some tact and reticence in this respect was equally to be expected. He might have taken example from Fritz Kreisler, who, as an Austrian citizen, served at the beginning of the war in the Austrian army, but was retired and returned to this country before we entered the conflict. From then on he acted with such dignity and tact, giving up all plain and public during that critical period, that he retained the personal respect and affection of all right-thinking Americans. As the war situation became more and more serious, Dr. Muck seemed to become more and more supercilious. In response to a perfectly natural impulse, the public demanded that our orchestras begin or end their concerts with the playing of the national anthem. This had become the symbol of our patriotism, and as millions of our young men began to gather in the camps and to be sent abroad in the transports, the Star-Spangled Banner was beginning to awaken in every heart emotions that were hardly known to our generation before the war. Dr. Muck refused to play the anthem, not from Boston nor New York, alas, but from Providence, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh. Angry mutterings began to be heard. These cities insisted that an orchestra which, in time of war, was not willing to play our national anthem should not be permitted to play at all. Dr. Muck's answer to this, in a newspaper interview, was that he conducted an artistic institution, that the Star-Spangled Banner is not a work of art, and therefore only fit to be played by ballroom orchestras and military bands. Up till then I had upheld Dr. Muck insofar as it seemed just as bad taste for him as a German to conduct our national anthem in time of war with his country as it was for our public to insist that a German should do so. He could have said, "I am a German, my country is at war with yours. I am your guest because in 1915 Major Higginson insisted that I should return to America as he thought that the orchestra could not exist without me. I am now in an unfortunate position. Let me retire from conducting here during the war, or at least let your national anthem be conducted by the concertmaster." But this interview was a flippant evasion of the real point at issue, and when the reporter of the New York Tribune brought it to me, I exclaimed that I did not believe Dr. Muck could have said anything so outrageous, whereupon the reporter told me that his editor had expected me to say this and had therefore telegraphed to Boston and obtained a confirmation of the interview. I then expressed myself in very plain language regarding Dr. Muck's attitude, but his only answer was a new interview in which he declared that it was all a mistake, that he was not a German but a Swiss. This belated claim, which was based on technicalities and contrary to the facts, was promptly denied by the Swiss minister in Washington, and then suddenly Dr. Muck proceeded to conduct the Star-Spangled Banner, but in listless fashion, although half a dozen cities by that time barred their doors to him, and the concerts of the orchestra had to be canceled. In the meantime, the Secret Service men of the government had been patiently following every rumor and clue regarding Muck's supposed spy activities, and while they discovered that his attitude toward us was absolutely inimical and that he was therefore decidedly persona non grata, there was no foundation of truth in the rumors connecting him with wires, wireless, beacon lights, dynamite, or German submarines. The Secret Service men, however, discovered other disagreeable things in regard to him, which had no connection with the war, but which made him liable under the laws of our country. An incriminating package of letters was shown to him, and on his acknowledgment that he had written them, he was given the choice of internment as a prisoner of war at Fort Oglethorpe, or of being arrested on another charge and brought before the civil courts for trial. He naturally threw up his hands and accepted the former as a lesser evil. As he was released after the war on condition that he return to his own country, I cannot see that he has cause for anything but gratitude toward this country and its lenient treatment of him. The whole affair was a terrible shock to Major Higginson. He was an old man, and the discoveries regarding Dr. Muck, in whom he had placed such confidence and for whom he had vouched so absolutely, were unendurable to him. He had expected to continue his support of the orchestra, and it was generally assumed that he would leave the organization an endowment sufficient to maintain it after his death. Instead of this, he announced his determination to withdraw altogether, and left the decision whether they wished to continue the orchestra with a group of music lovers whom he had called together. For a time its future was in great doubt. 30 of the players were discharged because of their German nationality, but money was subscribed by various Boston citizens to rebuild the orchestra, and today, under the leadership of Pierre Monteux, it is fast regaining its old excellence. It will never again occupy the unique position it held 25 years and more ago, because since then so many other symphony orchestras have been founded in America on similar lines and with similar generous endowments. But to Major Higginson will always belong the glory of having blazed the trail. He set the standard, and America will give his memory loving reverence and gratitude. End of section 25.
Section 26 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 19. Margaret, Anglin, and the Greek Plays. During the winter of 1915, I received a letter from Margaret Anglin, our distinguished American actress, asking me to compose the incidental music for 2 Greek plays which she intended to produce the following summer at the great open-air Greek theater in Berkeley, California. The plays selected were the Iphigenia in Aulis of Euripides and Medea of Sophocles. I was fascinated by the problem involved, as it necessitated not only the composing of the music, but the creation of a form in which it was to be cast. We know very little of the music of the ancient Greeks, and if we sought to imitate that, it would sound so archaic and even unnatural to our modern ears as to fail in properly supporting the emotions of the drama for us. While the Greeks had developed the technique of the drama to a remarkable extent, music as an art was at that time in its infancy, although its importance was fully recognized by Plato and the great dramatists. The problem, for me, was to write music which should take full advantage of the modern development of harmony and orchestration, and form an emotional current on which the drama could float without being in any way submerged. The treatment of the Greek chorus was another problem for which I had no precedents. Mendelssohn had written incidental music to Antigone, but this music does not represent Mendelssohn at his best, as much of it is dry and academic in character. The Greek choruses usually begin with a recital of some old story of mythology with which every Greek in the audience of that era had been familiar since childhood. Gradually, this story is brought into connection with the situation on stage and reaches its climax when the chorus implores the actors to draw their lessons from it. These choruses I treated in various ways, according to the needs of the dramatic situation. Some were recited to a soft but expressive undercurrent of music. Others were sung, and still others were a combination of both. I would have the story of the old Greek legend recited by the first leader of the chorus. Then the second leader, as he applied it to the dramatic situation, would burst into song, until in the third phase the entire chorus would join in their impassioned pleadings or warnings. In the spring of 1915, I took a little cottage in Setauket, Long Island, and there within 6 weeks wrote the entire music for the 2 plays, the orchestra parts being copied sheet by sheet as my score was finished. In June, I packed them in my bag and traveled across the continent to meet Margaret Anglin and take charge of the musical part of the production. On arriving in San Francisco, I found the great World's Fair already in full operation. Its Spanish architecture and the luxuriant verdure in which it was enclosed made it a perfect dream of beauty. But I gave myself little opportunity to enjoy it, as my real mission was across the bay at the Greek Theater in Berkeley, where Margaret Anglin and a company of players were already busily engaged from morning till evening in rehearsing. They were anxiously awaiting my music in order to make it fit in properly with the stage arrangements. The Greek Theater at the California University is one of the most remarkable structures of its kind in the world. Built amphitheatrically against the side of a hill and absolutely on the lines of the old Greek theaters, its top is fringed by somber eucalyptus trees. A few years before, I had seen a performance of the Bacchante of Euripides, given by a company of Roman actors at an antique amphitheater on the side of a hill overlooking Florence. Much of this performance had been impressive, but the music was tawdry, and as the play was given according to old Greek custom in the late afternoon, the cruel sunlight made the makeup of the actors and the garish colors of their costumes doubly prosaic. The ancient Greeks had no artificial lighting, and were therefore compelled to give their performances in daylight, although they sought to temper it so that night would fall at about the end of the play. Margaret Anglin, with her characteristic genius, perceived that a much greater glamour and stage illusion could be produced by giving her performances at night, leaving the audience in darkness and marking out the stage with great electric lights from above, which could be heightened or lessened according to the actual needs of the drama. If the drama in America had been treated as seriously by its cultured citizens as music has been, Margaret Anglin would perhaps be today the artistic head of an endowed theater devoted to the productions of Shakespeare, Goethe, Molière, Calderon, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These great masters of the stage would form just as important a part of her repertoire as the symphonies of Beethoven and Brahms make up an important part of the programs of the New York Symphony Orchestra. Margaret Anglin is today the greatest tragedienne of the American stage and should be acting Medea and Lady Macbeth. But instead of that, she has to tour the country playing green stockings and similar piffle, and only indulges her artistic ambitions and ideals in occasional productions of Greek dramas at her own risk and very much at her own expense. I was immensely interested in the rehearsals on the stage of the Greek Theater. They began at 9:30 in the morning and would often last, with an intermission of an hour or two for lunch, until 8 o'clock at night. But as they were held outdoors in the glorious fresh air of California, there was but little fatigue, and all concerned gave themselves up enthusiastically to Miss Anglin's direction and picturesque conception. She had hired a bungalow near the theater and a Japanese butler cook. This little Jap would always appear at 1 o'clock with a basket filled with the most delicious luncheon dishes, artistically decorated in the real Japanese style by his own deft fingers. He seemed to have a great penchant for the stage, asserted that he had acted Hamlet in Japan, and would sit for hours after luncheon watching the rehearsal, with his little inscrutable eyes fixed on the stage. I've often wondered whether, on his return to Japan, he gave performances of the Greek plays to his own compatriots, and whether any great changes or adaptations were necessary to make them comprehensible to his audiences. While the general plan of the action and grouping had been carefully worked out by Miss Anglin, she had an open mind and eye, and would often change the arrangement completely if an improvement could be effected thereby. This meant incessant repetitions, during which her patience and cheerful courtesy never failed her. A grand piano had been rolled into a corner of the stage, and I was so fascinated in watching the rehearsals and the gradual evolution of the stage pictures under her skillful hands that I insisted on always playing the incidental music myself, even though some of the scenes were repeated dozens of times. Miss Anglin had enlisted the services of 14 of California University's loveliest and most talented co-eds to form her Greek chorus. Beauty seems to flourish naturally on the Pacific coast. Some of these young ladies were glorious specimens of a truly Greek and statuesque charm. The recitation of one of the choruses, which was to be spoken in a kind of elastic rhythm to the music of the orchestra, was entrusted to one of these Dianas of Berkeley, and as she had no conception of this to her novel combination, Miss Anglin asked me to give her a separate rehearsal after lunch. I sat down at the piano and recited the chorus to her while I played the accompanying music. She stood by my side, listening intently, and looking like a statue of Diana of Ephesus. Then, bending her head with stately dignity, she said, "I get ya." Alas, the illusion was gone, and her voice brought me back suddenly from my dream of 400 B.C. to California of 1915. She had not got me, however, and I was finally compelled to give this chorus to another young lady less statuesque in form, but more clever in achieving plastic unity between speech and music. But my real troubles began when I tried to collect an orchestra of 50 for the performances. At that time, there were not many good players in San Francisco, and even those few were permanently engaged in the big World's Fair Orchestra. My first rehearsal was truly pathetic. I had been so spoiled by the many years of association with my lovely New York Symphony Orchestra. But where there's a will, there's a way, and by stealing a few men from the local theaters and borrowing a few more from the exposition orchestras, we were enabled to get a fairly good body of men assembled. The success of Miss Anglin's productions was truly remarkable. There were 10,000 people at each performance, and Iphigenia in Aulis had to be repeated twice. In this work, the camp of Agamemnon and its atmosphere of war were graphically illustrated, and 500 Berkeley students, picturesquely attired and well-trained, gave a very vivid picture of the soldiers' camp, especially at the end of the play, when the oracle has announced that the wind has changed, and these hundreds of soldiers rushed across the stage in a tumult of joy to board their ships and sail for Troy. The Electra, for which William First had written music for Miss Anglin years before, was also performed. Eventually I also composed the music for this play, and all three of the dramas were performed in New York a few years later at the request of Mr. Flagler on the stage of Carnegie Hall, which had been skillfully converted for the occasion into a Greek theater. We all marveled how vividly modern these plays, written more than 2,000 years ago, seemed as given under the artistic direction of Margaret Anglin. Electra, waiting outside the walls of the palace for the sound that shall announce to her the death of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra. Medea, having entered the palace to kill her own and Jason's children in order to punish him for his marriage to the young princess, while the chorus, shaking the iron grill of the doors, implore Medea not to slay her children. Iphigenia, youngest daughter of Agamemnon, descending alone the great flight of steps to suffer death in the sacred grove of the goddess Artemis, that her wrath may be appeased, and favorable winds may send the armies of Agamemnon to Troy. All these are unforgettable scenes, and I was overjoyed to feel that the music which I had written was not inappropriate, but formed a good background for these crucial moments. End of section 26.
Section 27 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 20, Dead Composers. I have a large library of musical works. It was begun by my father in 1857 and contains many scores of the composers of that period, sent to him for first performance in Germany. He added to it considerably during his 13 years in America as founder and conductor of the symphony and oratorio societies, and I have still further enlarged it since I became conductor of these two organizations. My library now virtually represents the entire symphonic development up to the present time. and as I look through my catalogue, I am amazed at the number of dead composers which it contains. By this I do not mean those who have passed away, but those who were once celebrated, were hailed as great, but whose works are now forgotten, and only repose undisturbed on dusty shelves like mine, for no efforts or housewife's art will prevent dust from seeping into the shelves of a New York City library. To mention a few of these dead composers alphabetically, who now plays the overtures of Auber's La Muette de Portici and Fra Diavolo, yet they figured frequently in my popular programs 30 years ago, and both operas deserve more than a passing recognition. The first was a stroke of genius, in which the commonplace Aubert rose to real heights. The heroine is a dumb girl, a prima donna without a voice, but very dramatically portrayed in the orchestra, and the atmosphere of a people fighting for freedom pervades the entire story. Fra Diavolo is a delightful comic opera. The only trouble is that the music is too good for the abjectly dull audiences that now frequent our theaters and want to see a musical show. Its plot is delightfully consistent, which is another reason for looking on it with disfavor today, but I have always regretted the nemesis which overcomes Fra Diavolo in the last act. This delightful robber has by that time so endeared himself to us that he should be allowed at the end to escape, in order that the public may live in the hope of further pranks and misdeeds from him. 30 years ago, I gave the first performance in America of a symphony in D minor by Anton Bruckner. He was a man with the brains of a peasant, but the soul of a real musician, and with a marvelous gift for improvisation, although he was, intellectually, incapable of developing and balancing his themes properly. A noisy party in Vienna wished, at the time, to acclaim this disciple of Wagner as a genius, to counteract the constantly growing admiration for Brahms, and more recently, such eminent conductors as Mahler have tried to popularize Bruckner's symphonies, but they have never gained a permanent hold on our public. Several years after my performance of his symphony in D, I was in Berlin, and Siegfried Ochs, the conductor of the famous Philharmonic Choir, brought a little bald-headed man of over 70 years of age to my table at the Kaiserhof. On my being introduced to him, he suddenly grabbed my hand, and saying, "You are the Mr. Damrosch, who has given my symphony in America," he proceeded, to my great embarrassment, to cover my hand with kisses. Vienna is full of stories of his childlike gentleness and modesty. Hans Richter once invited him to conduct one of his own symphonies with the famous orchestra of the Vienna Society of Friends of Music. At the rehearsal, he stood on the conductor's platform, stick in his hand, with a beatific smile on his face. The orchestra were all ready to begin, but he would not lift his stick to give the signal. Finally, Rosé, the concertmaster, said to him, "We are quite ready. Begin, Herr Bruckner." "Oh, no," he answered. "After you, gentlemen." At that time, he was also commanded to appear before the old Emperor Franz Joseph to receive a decoration. After he had been decorated, the Emperor turned to him and said very kindly, "Herr Bruckner, is there anything more I can do for you?" Bruckner answered in a trembling voice, "Won't you please speak to Mr. Hanslick, the famous musical critic of Vienna, that he should not write such nasty criticisms about my symphonies?" In my father's time, the overture to Cherubini's Anacreon had a frequent and honored place on his programs. A modern audience would vote it too dry and old-fashioned. The music of Niels W. Gade was quite a favorite with our grandfathers and grandmothers, but he is unendurable today. A new orchestral composition of Karl Goldmark was eagerly waited for 40 years ago, and there was great rivalry between my father and Theodor Thomas as to which should have the privilege of performing it first. People used to revel in his exotic and luxuriant orchestration, but today his colors have faded before the greater glories of Strauss and Debussy and Ravel, and only his rustic symphony occasionally figures on our programs. During the second year of the German opera at the Metropolitan, Goldmark's Queen of Sheba made a success which equaled that of the Wagner operas. Solomon's Temple, painted in gold, the Jewish rituals, the Oriental harmonies, and the naive surprise of the public on seeing biblical characters upon a modern operatic stage, all combined to make the work a sensational success. Today it has disappeared completely from the repertoire of European and American opera houses. The fate of Franz Liszt as a composer is still more tragic because it is partly undeserved. He created the form of the symphonic poem, but those who succeeded him have developed it so much farther as to leave his work somewhat submerged. I still have great admiration for his Faust Symphony, but neither I nor others of my colleagues who share this admiration have been able to make this work really popular with the general public. His Dante Symphony, Festklänge, and Orpheus received still fewer public performances, and his Sequin Entend sur les montagnes has never been performed here to my knowledge. But Les Préludes and the 2 piano concertos, on the contrary, are still played ad nauseum. The symphonies of Gustav Mahler have never received genuine recognition here, although he was a very interesting apparition in the musical field. He was a profound musician and one of the best conductors of Europe, and it is possible that, in the latter capacity, he occupied himself so intensely and constantly in analyzing and interpreting the works of the great masters that he lost the power to develop himself as composer on original lines. All his life he composed, but his moments of real beauty are too rare, and the listener has to wade through pages of dreary emptiness, which no artificial connection with philosophic ideas can fill with real importance. The feverish restlessness characteristic of the man reflects itself in his music, which is fragmentary in character and lacks continuity of thought and development. He could write cleverly, in the style of Haydn or Berlioz or Wagner, and without forgetting Beethoven, but he was never able to write in the style of Mahler. Of all the greater composers of the last 100 years, no one has been killed oftener than Mendelssohn, yet he always seems to come back again with a new renaissance. His music for Athalie, his Reformation Symphony, his overtures to Melusine and Ruy Blas are dead as a doornail, but his violin concerto is still the most perfect example of its kind. His Midsummer Night's Dream, the best incidental music ever conceived for a Shakespearean play, his Elijah, the most dramatic oratorio ever written, and the Scotch and Italian symphonies still possess a delightful and eternal charm. The works of Meyerbeer, on the contrary, have deservedly disappeared even from our popular programs. Those empty torchlight dances and the vulgar ballet music from Le Prophète. I confess, though, that I still have a sneaking fondness for the Coronation March, perhaps because I had to conduct it so many times at the Metropolitan when I first began conducting the operas there, that the same man who penned the glorious fourth act of the Huguenots could have been satisfied with the empty drivel which preponderates during the rest of that opera is one of the internal mysteries. About 30 years ago, Moritz Moszkowski was one of the most popular composers of the day, especially for the piano, but modern ears have but little use for his delicate, though evanescent, charm, and his orchestral suites are but rarely heard today. He has lived in Paris for many years, and during the war he suffered greatly. Advancing years and a long illness had left him very weak, and it seemed almost as if the musical world, in which he had been so popular a figure, had forgotten him completely. But last winter, Ernest Schelling, one of our best American pianists, and an old friend of Moszkowski's, conceived the happy idea of giving a testimonial concert in his honor, which should be thoroughly original in character. He, together with his distinguished colleague Harold Bauer, accordingly enlisted the cooperation of 12 other celebrated pianists who were in America during the winter. This list, a truly remarkable one, included Elie Ney, Ignaz Friedman, Osip Gabrilowitsch, Rudolf Ganz, Leopold Godowsky, Percy Granger, Ernest Hutchison, Alexander Lambert, Joseph Levine, Yolande Merriot, Germaine Schnitzer, and Sigismund Stochowski. Mr. Flagler offered the services of our orchestra, but as the stage was to be completely filled with 14 grand pianos, there was no room for an orchestra, and I had to content myself with the possibility of being taken on as a piano mover, as I longed to take part in the affair in any capacity. The morning before the concert, however, I received a hurried SOS telephone call from Ernest Schelling. He said, "Please come down to Steinway's immediately and help us out. The 14 pianists are all here for rehearsal. We have arranged for several compositions to be played by all of us, but alas, each one has his own individual interpretation, and nothing seems to make us play together. We need a conductor." When I arrived at the rehearsal hall, the confusion was indeed indescribable, and it took some time to bring order out of chaos. Here were 14 of the world's greatest pianists, veritable prima donnas of the piano, but several had never learned to adapt themselves to play together for a common musical purpose. And when I rapped on my stand for silence in order to begin the Spanish dances of Moszkowski, at least 5 or 6 continued their infernal improvising, playing of scales, and pianistic fireworks. By using heroic measures, I gradually produced a semblance of order and gave the signal for the beginning of the music. The effect was extraordinary. Several of these pianists had never followed a conductor's beat, and after the first 10 bars, 2 of them rushed over to me, the one violently exclaiming that the tempo was too fast, and the other insisting with equal vehemence that it was too slow. Finally, I obtained silence and told my pianistic orchestra that they were undoubtedly the 14 greatest pianists in the world, and that the interpretation of each one of them was undoubtedly equally the greatest in the world, but as they represented 14 different grades and shades of interpretation, I intended to take the matter into my own hands, and they would just have to follow my beat, whether they liked my tempo or not. This was greeted with a roar of approval, and we now settled down to the work of rehearsing as solemnly as if these prima donnas of the Ivories were orchestral musicians and routine members of the New York Musical Union. Order followed anarchy, and the results achieved were not without higher artistic interest, especially as I detailed such accomplished and routine musicians as Harold Bauer, Ernest Schelling, and Osip Gabrilowitsch to use their own discretion in orchestrating the dances. Gabrilowitsch, for instance, reserved himself for the entrance of the brasses. Bauer invested some of the more delicate portions with agile runs of flutes and clarinets, while Schelling imitated the kettle drums and cymbals with thrilling effect. Carnegie Hall was jammed, and the audience in a gale of happiness at the highly original proceedings. The stage was so crowded with the 14 huge pianos that after threading my way through them to introduce Madame Alma Gluck, who was to auction off one of the programs, I said that what this concert evidently needed most was not a conductor, but a traffic policeman. Perhaps the most artistic feature of the program was the performance of Schumann's carnival scenes, in which each little movement represents a separate carnival figure. The 14 pianists drew lots as to which was to play which. The introduction was played by all, but after that, in quick kaleidoscopic succession, the different carnival figures fairly danced from the stage into the audience, as a pianist on one side of the stage would begin, followed by one from the other side, and so on. It was a most remarkable opportunity to compare the interpretive characteristics of the different pianists. The receipts were considerably swelled by the auctioning of programs and autographed photographs of Moszkowski, and $15,000 was the result of an entertainment truly unique in the history of music. The most popular modern symphonic composer in the 70s was Joachim Raff. He was a young Swiss who, without a cent in his pocket, had walked many miles from his little village in order to hear Liszt play at a concert in Zurich. Liszt became interested in his undoubted talent and took him with him to Weimar as musical secretary. Raff, von Bülow, and my father became great friends. But while everyone expected that Raff would continue as a true disciple of Liszt's and write in the revolutionary style of his master, he gradually turned from him and leaned more and more on classic models, although in several of his symphonies he retained the Lisztian idea of program music. As he grew older, his conservatism became more and more marked. He had great facility and produced works in every known form of music, and his vanity gradually made him believe that his string quartets were equal to Mozart's, his symphonies to Beethoven's, and his oratorios to Handel's and Mendelssohn's. His fecundity was astonishing, but his pen too fluent for real musical depth. There was hardly a winter, however, that Theodore Thomas or my father did not perform Imbalda, or the very programmatic Leonora Symphony. This work, in which the last movement follows closely, and dramatically Berger's famous ballad, had an enormous popularity, and is occasionally performed by us today, but in general the name of Raff means but little to modern concert-goers. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was Anton Rubinstein, who became, after Liszt, the world's greatest piano virtuoso. The world feted him, spoiled him, and sated him with adulation. It all brought him no satisfaction. He was consumed with the ambition to be considered a great composer, and wrote incessantly, never criticizing what he wrote. His Ocean Symphony had a tremendous popularity in New York 50 years ago, but today no one would listen to it. His D minor concerto has been played ad nauseum by every pianist, but today it is threadbare and frayed at the edges. Only the supreme skill of a Joseph Hoffmann can make his G major concerto endurable and cloak its musical emptiness. He wrote opera after opera in a feverish desire to eclipse Wagner, whom he hated, and whose popularity he envied, and after Parsifal had been proclaimed at Bayreuth as a sacred festival play, he immediately proceeded to write an opera on the life of Christ, which is so dull and unconvincing that it has hardly had a performance anywhere. His personal popularity was so great that Pollini, the astute manager of the Hamburg Opera, occasionally used to put on one of his operas on condition that he himself would come to Hamburg to conduct the opening performance. His presence would ensure a crowded house. At the last rehearsal of one of these operas, Rubinstein was so well pleased with the work of the orchestra that he turned to them and said, "Gentlemen, if my opera is a success, you must all come to my hotel after the performance for a champagne supper." Unfortunately, the opera was a decided frost, and the audience so undemonstrative that Rubinstein, in absolute disgust, laid down the stick after the second act and, bidding the local conductor finish the opera, returned dejectedly to his hotel and went to bed. At 11 o'clock there was a knock at his door. "Who is it?" he shouted in great irritation. "It is I, Herr Rubinstein, the double bass player from the opera orchestra. What do you want?" "I have come for the champagne supper." "What nonsense," raged Rubinstein. "The opera was a ghastly failure." "Well, Herr Rubinstein," answered the thirsty and undaunted double bass player, "I liked it." The disappearance of Schumann's symphonies from concert programs is due to the fact that he was never at ease in writing for the orchestra. His instrumentation is so thick and turgid as to be the despair of conductors. So much of the music is exquisite, but it is like a precious jewel embedded in a foreign substance, which conductors try in vain to remove by changing the dynamics of this or that instrument, or by leaving out an unnecessary doubling up of certain harmonies. All these devices, however, can do but little. More heroic measures are necessary, and I was much interested last summer when Sir Edward Elgar asked me what I would think of his deliberately reorchestrating an entire symphony of Schumann's. I heartily applauded such an idea, and begged him to carry it out speedily, as there is perhaps no one living today who better understands the colors of the orchestra, and knows how to produce the most subtle shades in the intermingling of the different instruments. In the meantime, Frederick Stock, the noted conductor of the Chicago Orchestra, has taken the bull by the horns, and has written a new orchestration of Schumann's Rhenish Symphony, which I hope to produce this winter. Are Sousa's marches played nowadays? They should be. They are better than the military marches of Europe of today, and while one cannot put them into the category of higher musical efforts, they are the only American compositions of musical worth that have triumphantly blazed their way all over the world. Richard Strauss, who 25 years ago was the most interesting star in the musical firmament, has lived long enough to have outlived a part of his popularity. He never originated a musical form, but accepted the symphonic poem of Liszt and the music drama of Wagner as models. His workmanship is infinitely greater than Liszt's, his counterpoint stupendous in its boldness, and in his treatment of the orchestra he sometimes transcends even Wagner in the originality of his orchestral combinations. But his compositions lack the ideality of either of these masters, and because of this, and in spite of his marvelous paraphernalia, his works seem to carry within them the seeds of their own decay. The gods endowed this man at his birth, perhaps more richly than any other musician musician of our time, but something within him has made him relinquish the greatest of their gifts and has turned him to less pure ideals. In the Symphonia Domestica, the daily life of husband, wife, and baby are characterized by an orchestra of 110 players with such noisy fury and realistic prose as to give one an altogether distorted insight into what is supposedly a page from the composer's diary. But the music descriptive of the composer who, after these dreadful domestic squabbles, retires to his workroom, lights his lamp, and begins to communicate with his muse is so beautiful as to fill us with a deep regret that one so winged for flight in the ether should be so content to walk on the earth. The instrumental devices depicting Don Quixote's adventure with the sheep and his fight with the windmill, which aroused such astonishment and admiration when they were first heard, have already lost their effect and are listened to today with hardly a smile. The final scene, however, depicting the dying of Don Quixote, is so beautiful and tragic in its expression as to bring tears to the listener. The Heldenleben is to me a work of noisy, bombastic emptiness from beginning to end, and one might call it typical of certain German currents of today. It would, however, be manifestly unfair to call it typically German, as a race that has produced Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner will surely find other men to continue their glorious traditions. A composer's fame is not affirmed by professional musicians, but by the general public, whose judgment in the end is infallible. A great masterwork that is not destroyed will always eventually be recognized as such, whether, like the Venus de Milo, it has lain hidden for centuries beneath the earth, or like the Matthew Passion of Bach, equally hidden in the dusty shelves of the Royal Library of Berlin, to be rediscovered by Mendelssohn and pronounced the greatest religious choral work ever written. The two works of Strauss, which have retained their popularity with the public, are undoubtedly his best, as their requirements do not enlist such qualities as he does not possess or has not sought to develop. Until Eulenspiegel, Strauss's talent for mordant realism finds full expression. The wild pranks of Eulenspiegel follow each other in mad, cynical humor, and in the limited form of program music, the work is flawless. His Salome is as perfect a union with Oscar Wilde's marvelous play as the Pelléas and Melisande of Maeterlinck and Debussy. In both, the composers have so steeped themselves in the spirit of the poem as to enhance its beauty. But with all my admiration for Salome, I have never been able to sit through the final scene without a feeling of disgust, which sometimes mounted even to physical nausea. When Salome sings her horrible love music to the head of John the Baptist, it has always seemed to me a parody on the glorious finale of Tristan and Isolde. I have spoken in another chapter of Tchaikovsky's visit to America in 1891 as a guest of the Symphony Society. For 25 years, his popularity was enormous, and the mere announcement of his Symphonie Pathétique was sufficient to draw a crowded house. His symphonies appeared more often on our concert programs than those of any other composer. They have a rhythmic and elemental strength which appealed even to the unmusical, but today a distinct lessening of this popularity is noticeable. There is a lack of real symphonic development of his themes, and certain crudities of workmanship stand out more clearly as the works have become better known. Young conductors anxious for ready and cheap applause still choose one of his symphonies for their debut, and the melodic charm of his lighter music, if not heard too often, will retain its place in the affection of our public for some time longer. And now we come to the greatest genius of the 19th century, Richard Wagner. What? Exclaims my reader. Do you consider him dead? God forbid. The wings of his genius are still soaring aloft in the ether, but there is no doubt that the attitude of the world of today toward his music is absolutely different from that of 50 or 60 years ago, when he first electrified or infuriated a public amazed at his daring innovations. The inevitable has happened. Wagner has become a classic. I was a boy of 15 when I heard the first performance of Lohengrin at the Old Academy of Music. The opera was sung in Italian with Italo Campanini as Lohengrin, Valeria as Elsa, and our own Anne Louise Carey as Ortrud. The conductor was old Luigi Arditi. I sat in the front row in the family circle, and was so excited by the drama and the music that at the end of the double male chorus, which accompanies the approach of Lohengrin in the boat drawn by the swan as the God-sent deliverer of Elsa, the tears rushed down my cheeks, but they were happy tears, and a natural relief from the tension which the music had created in me. Each succeeding opera of Wagner's was a similar revelation. I pored over the scores of the Nibelungen trilogy during every hour left me from schoolwork and piano practice. In fact, I often stole time from the latter and would gladly have given up my entire school if my parents had not very properly kept me where I belonged. Later on, my founding of the Damrosch Opera Company for the sole purpose of producing Wagner operas seemed an inner necessity, and I was driven to it by a force stronger than myself. For years, a Wagner program, whether it was at a symphony concert in New York, or in Oklahoma on a Western tour, or at the Willow Grove summer concerts, drew the largest audiences, and the same orchestral excerpts were repeated by me and other conductors year after year, and received by our public with excited enthusiasm. Today, the amazement which his music called forth is no longer apparent. He is admired and loved, but the nerves of the younger generation are not thrilled by his harmonies as ours were. His works repose upon our shelves, bound in morocco and gold, and occupy places of honor, but, alas, on several of them the dust is beginning to gather, and many of the young people of today find Lohengrin monotonous and vote unanimously that Tannhäuser's recital of his pilgrimage to Rome is too long. Time and continued occupation with Wagner's music may have made me more critical and analytical, and I am no longer in complete and enthusiastic accord with some of his theories regarding the music drama, but much of his music still sweeps me off my feet, and his Meistersinger, which is so happy and perfect a compromise between the opera and the music drama, is to me still the greatest musical work of our times. I have spoken above of the finality of the judgment of the public regarding the ultimate vitality of an art work. Conductors have had their personal convictions and have tried to force them upon our audiences. But unless these convictions were based on actual worth, the public has in the end, consciously or unconsciously, rejected them. Sometimes unworthy composers have had momentary popularity, but they were born but to dance in the sun for one day and then to die. My orchestral parts of the symphonies of Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms are old and worn by many rehearsals and performances, and some of them have been patched up and pasted together by my librarian so many times that they have had to be replaced by new ones twice over. I have performed them for nearly 40 years, and the grandchildren of my audiences of 1885 are now listening to them with equal happiness. A few years ago I discovered a lovely symphony by Mozart, which had never been played in New York, and I was as proud of this as if it had been the fourth dimension. The works of these masters are lifted above the fashion of the moment, and their creators smile upon us serenely and eternally from the heavens in which they dwell as gods among the gods. End of section 27. Section 28 of my musical life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 21, Postlude. These reminiscences were begun in New York in April 1922 and finished the following August in Bar Harbor, Maine. My friends had urged me for some time to write down my experiences because they thought that the many and varied events in a long musical life would prove interesting to American musicians and readers generally. I do not know. On rereading the foregoing pages in the proof sheets, I feel that many happenings which seemed of great importance to me may prove but dull reading to others, but at least I have tried to tell a truthful tale and to give an honest account of my aspirations and struggles. I have climbed a few hills, but only to see the mountains beyond rising higher and higher, the path upward often indiscernible through the mists surrounding the peaks. I loved the people among whom my father settled because he firmly believed that in America his children would have a greater opportunity for development than in old Europe. The musical field in America is certainly wonderful in its possibilities, and all my life I have reached out with both hands and have worked incessantly and enthusiastically in my calling. In part, at least, I have tried to repay what I owe to my compatriots for their confidence and help. But the power of the individual is comparatively small, and while our musicians have already accomplished miracles within the short period that music has played a part in our civilization, so much yet remains to be done that I long for at least 100 more years of life, partly to continue my work, but still more to satisfy my eager curiosity as to the musical future of our people. If this book serves to encourage my younger colleagues in their efforts to increase the love and appreciation of music in our country, it has not been written in vain. End of section 28. End of My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch.